Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we wander through the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Tonight, we're traveling to a lost chapter of Earth's story, more than 300 million years ago, long before the dinosaurs, long before flowers or grass. The air back then was not like the air we breathe today. Now, our atmosphere holds just 21% oxygen, a perfect balance between life and fire. But in that ancient time, that balance broke. Oxygen climbed to nearly 35%. That single difference was enough to transform the entire planet. Fires burned forests with terrifying ease, even after rain. Lightning didn't just spark fires, it reshaped continents, and life itself, shaped by the abundance of air, began to grow into impossible forms. There were dragonflies the size of hawks, and millipedes longer than cars, gliding through steaming forests, where amphibians the length of crocodiles lurked between fern trees. They ruled the land long before reptiles. The air that fed them was both a blessing and a curse, rich enough to spark evolution, volatile enough to destroy it. But how was Earth able to breathe that deeply? What strange chemistry allowed its atmosphere to become both cradle and curse? And why did this strange abundance, this invisible flood of oxygen, eventually vanish, leaving behind a quieter, safer world? Tonight, we'll drift quietly into that forgotten age, to a world so full of oxygen it became both paradise and peril. But before we begin, if you find peace in stories like this, slow, soothing, and filled with quiet wonder, I'd love it if you gave this video a gentle like and maybe tap subscribe. It helps other curious dreamers find their way to this calm little corner of the internet and lets the algorithm know that sleep and science go perfectly together. And if you'd be so kind, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far across the world this little sleepy corner of science travels. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and together let's step softly into the age when oxygen made monsters. The air around us feels ordinary. We breathe without thinking, unaware that every inhale carries the memory of fire. In this invisible mix of gases, 21 parts out of 100 are oxygen, and that number, so constant, so quiet, keeps the world alive without letting it burn. It is balance disguised as simplicity. If oxygen fell much lower, fires would fade, and creatures like us would struggle to draw enough breath to move. If it rose higher, every spark, every bolt of lightning, every dry leaf could ignite a forest. Somewhere between those extremes lies the thin, fragile range where life and flame can coexist. When scientists measure air, they often talk in percentages. 16%, that is the minimum oxygen a flame needs to stay alive. A candle will flicker and die below that point, starved of breath. But as the number climbs, flames change their character. At 21%, fire burns bright, but controlled, it feeds, then fades. At 35%, even damp wood can burst into flame. Our atmosphere today sits exactly between stillness and chaos. Walk through a forest after rain and feel how safe it seems. The wet bark, the soft mist, the hush that blankets everything. That calm depends on chemistry. The oxygen in our air is just low enough to let the forest breathe without turning to ash. A few percent higher, and that same quiet place could not exist. The heat of lightning would be enough to ignite green leaves. Even a fallen branch, slick with dew, could smolder until the entire horizon glowed red. The planet's perfect balance is not a coincidence. It is the result of countless feedbacks, plant growth, decay, ocean chemistry, and weather, all shaping and reshaping the thin film of air that touches life. Every cell that breathes takes part in maintaining it. Each lung, each leaf is a gear in an invisible machine that holds the line at 21%. The chemistry of breathing and burning are mirror images. In both, oxygen meets carbon. In one case, it creates fire. In the other, it creates life. The difference lies in the pace. In the lungs, oxygen feeds our cells one molecule at a time. In the open air, that same meeting happens all at once, releasing heat and light instead of thought and motion. When we exhale, we return carbon dioxide to the air, fuel for plants. They, in turn, draw it in and release oxygen back. It is a rhythm older than any heartbeat, a pulse shared by forests, oceans, and skies. The steady 21% we live in is not fixed by design, but by the ongoing conversation between everything that breathes and everything that burns. Even a small change would rewrite the rules of life. Imagine if oxygen dropped to 17%. Fires would die quickly, and insects that rely on passive breathing might suffocate. Mountain air, already thin, would become dangerous. Now imagine it rising to 25%. The sound of thunder would mean more than rain. It would mean firestorms that race faster than any creature can run. Evolution itself would shift, favoring species that could survive heat and flame. But it has not. The world we inherited is the calm that followed a storm, a balance reached after millions of years of chaos and fire. In the deep rock and ancient coal seams, the scars of that time remain, showing what happens when air grows too rich for safety. Even now, the difference between life and destruction hangs on fractions. For every 100 breaths, the loss or gain of a single one could tip the world toward silence or flame. That thin margin defines our comfort, our forests, our very shape. We often think of air as endless and uniform, but it is alive in its own way. Winds carry seeds, clouds form from breath, and the composition of the sky changes with every season. The balance we live in is maintained by billions of small acts, a leaf opening at dawn, an ocean wave pulling gas from the wind, a fire consuming what it can before dying. When night falls and the air cools, the chemistry slows, plants draw in less carbon dioxide, animals rest, exhaling what they have made, and in that pause the atmosphere settles again to the quiet precision that keeps it stable. 21%, not by accident, but by constant negotiation between life and earth. The Carboniferous Age proved how easily that balance can break. In that ancient world, forests rose faster than the planet could handle their gift. The air thickened with oxygen until every storm became a spark, and every spark became a fire. It was chemistry, not wrath, that turned abundance into danger. Today's air, the one we breathe so casually, is the product of restraint learned through catastrophe. Each molecule of oxygen represents both survival and memory, a record of times when too much of a good thing nearly unmade the living world. And so we breathe it now, unaware of how precisely the numbers must align for the world to stay calm, for the flame to wait, for the forest to grow without fear. The air seems ordinary, but it is not. It is a truce, constantly renewed between life and fire. Long before the world was green, earth was quiet. The continents lay under pale skies, their surfaces rough and empty, shaped by wind and rain, but untouched by roots. The land was brown and gray, broken by patches of shallow water where algae clung to life. It was a world of stone and silence where nothing yet reached upward. Along the edges of ancient seas, the first plants began their quiet work. They were small and fragile, their bodies thin as blades of moss, their lives bound to the comfort of moisture. They clung to the mud in shallow pools, breathing through water as much as air. There were no deep roots to anchor them, no wood to lift them toward light. The land was not yet ready for forests. For millions of years, This world changed slowly. Rain washed minerals from rock, rivers carved new paths through sand and clay. The air was heavier then, filled with carbon dioxide, a sky still recovering from volcanic breath. Life was patient. Each new generation of plant reached a little farther from the water's edge, testing dryness like a cautious traveler touching foreign ground. Then, somewhere in that slow unfolding of time, something extraordinary appeared, a secret written into the tissues of plants themselves. Inside their stems formed channels, tiny passageways that could carry water upward and send strength through every leaf. It was the birth of vascular tissue, and with it the power to grow tall. That single change rewrote the history of land. Plants no longer needed to crawl near the water's edge. They could rise, they could stretch toward the sun, pulling moisture from the soil below and sending it high into the air above. Their roots began to explore the earth, breaking apart rock and feeding on the minerals within. The first stems hardened, forming primitive trunks that could stand against the wind. In these new bodies, Earth found its architects. Slowly, green began to spread across the continents. The coastlines darkened, the wetlands thickened, and the first forests began to take shape. It was not yet the lush world of towering trees we imagine, but the beginning, a patchwork of low ferns, club mosses, and horsetails, their stems glistening in the damp air. As these plants multiplied, the planet itself began to breathe differently. Each leaf, each frond drew carbon from the air and released oxygen in return. The chemistry of the atmosphere started to change. It was subtle at first, unnoticed in the flow of ages, but it marked the beginning of a shift that would alter everything. The early forests trapped sunlight in living matter. When these plants died, their remains fell into the mud and water, where decay was slow. The carbon they held was buried instead of released, sealed away beneath layers of sediment. With every passing millennium, more carbon vanished underground while oxygen built up above. The land that had once been barren was now alive with chemistry. Oceans responded too. The balance of gases between sea and sky began to shift. Storms carried nutrients inland, feeding new growth. Rivers returned carbon from stone to water, linking the cycles of life and earth. For the first time, the continents were not just shapes of rock, they were lungs, breathing in rhythm with the seas. The landscape itself began to soften. Roots held soil together. Leaves shaded the ground, slowing the wind, cooling the air. Rain no longer ran freely across bare rock, but soaked into living earth, feeding the roots below. The planet was learning to hold life, to sustain it, to build from it. And as the forests thickened, the sky brightened. The haze that once dimmed the sunlight began to thin, replaced by air clearer than the planet had ever known. With more oxygen, the world's colors deepened, the greens sharper, the skies bluer, the water more reflective. Light reached farther through the atmosphere, carrying warmth to places it had never touched before. It was not an overnight transformation. It was a slow, deliberate symphony of biology and geology, each note played over millions of years. Yet when seen from a distance in time, it feels like a single turning point, the moment when land stopped being a stage and became a living part of the story. The first forests were unlike any that exist today. They had no flowers, no seeds, only spores drifting through the air like fine dust. Their roots formed webs beneath the soil, binding continents into quiet networks of life. And as they spread, so did their influence. The atmosphere that had once suffocated fire would soon begin to feed it. These ancient plants, reaching upward for light, could not have known what they were creating. With every breath they gave, they changed the balance of the sky. The air grew richer, the fires easier to spark, the creatures larger and more alive. What began as a whisper of green along the shore would soon remake the planet's destiny. The forests had arrived, and with them, the slow heartbeat of oxygen had begun to rise. The lowlands breathed in steam and sunlight. Shallow waters mirrored green crowns, and a humid hush folded across the land. Towering lycopsids rose like columns of living glass, their trunks pale and smooth, their fronds trembling under the weight of dew. Between their roots, the ground sank and sighed, a soft sponge of rot and life, where roots met water and time dissolved into mist. This was a world newly dressed in shadow and light. Sunlight sifted through curtains of leaves, breaking into green storms that drifted and settled like spores. The air was thick enough to hold sound, muffling the rustle of ferns and the drip of distant rain. Beneath the canopy, amphibians slipped through pools of bronze water, their movements barely disturbing the stillness. Insects the size of birds hovered in shafts of light, wings gleaming like wet parchment. Every breath carried the scent of peat and sap, a sweetness born of slow decay. The continents were low and wet, a mosaic of swamps stretching farther than the horizon. Rivers wound lazily through tangled roots, their waters colored with tannins and the memory of leaves. Each flood left behind another layer of mud and mulch, sealing away the generations that had come before. Nothing stood still for long. Every fallen branch was devoured by moss, every surface claimed by something green. It was as if the planet itself had discovered how to dream in chlorophyll. Lycopsids and giant horsetails grew side by side, competing not for ground but for light. They built cities of stems and crowns, great cathedrals of plant tissue reaching upward toward the warmth. Sunlight fell in patches, turning the forest floor into a shifting mosaic of shadow. In that dim light, ferns unfurled with slow, deliberate grace, their fronds coiling open like ancient scrolls. Each movement, though unseen by the naked eye, was part of an endless rhythm of growth and surrender. There were no flowers here, no hum of bees or flutter of petals. The forest spoke in quieter tongues. Spores floated like green dust in the air, carried by wind and chance. When rain came, it did not strike sharply. It sighed. Droplets clung to every surface, merging into rivulets that slipped down trunks and vanished into the soft, breathing earth. Even decay was gentle, a slow transformation rather than an ending. From above, the forests appeared endless, a living sea of emerald and vapor. The horizon shimmered where heat met mist, and the line between sky and land blurred. Storms rolled through these jungles, not as destroyers, but as gardeners, feeding nitrogen to the soil with each flash of lightning. After every rainfall, the air grew heavier, richer, more alive. Life had found a tempo that no drought could break. Everywhere the partnership between plant and water deepened. Roots knitted the ground together, trapping sediments and slowing rivers. Each tree stood upon the remains of its ancestors, layer upon layer, pressed into the earth's damp memory. Fungi traced thin white threads through the peat, breaking down what little they could, while the rest sank into darkness, preserved, waiting. The jungles did not understand what they were making. Their abundance rewrote the landscape in silence. Beneath the roots, chemistry turned inward. Buried wood became matter suspended between worlds, neither living nor gone, merely sleeping. In time, these layers would harden into black stone, a record of an age when life itself began to alter the air. Through it all, the planet exhaled. The forests were its lungs, and the rhythm of photosynthesis was its heartbeat. Each dawn filled the sky with breath, and each dusk folded that breath into soil. The process was patient, relentless, unseen. The land had begun to write its own future in the language of carbon and time. To walk through those jungles, if one could, would be to enter a world so saturated with life that silence itself seemed alive. The air shimmered with invisible motion, a choreography of spores, droplets, and light. Every surface glistened, every sound softened, every color deepened into shades of green the eye could not name. Those endless canopies also changed how the land used carbon, a slow process we will meet again. Beneath that green cathedral, the quiet bookkeeping of carbon was beginning to rewrite the chemistry of the air. The world was still wrapped in its green haze. The forests, thick and unbroken, stretched from one horizon to the next. Their roots gripped the continents, their crowns reached into clouds, and their breath filled the sky with a rising tide of oxygen. The Carboniferous jungles had grown so vast, so constant, that they had begun to alter the planet's chemistry in ways no living thing had before. Each tree was a slow engine. By day, sunlight fell upon its leaves, and the air shimmered as invisible exchanges took place. Carbon dioxide entered, oxygen left, and the balance of the atmosphere tilted ever so slightly toward breath and flame. The change was not fast. It was patient, unhurried, like the heartbeat of the planet itself. But in the silence of deep time, patience can move mountains. When these trees died, they did not vanish. Fallen trunks sank into the wet ground, covered by silt and water. Beneath the swampy floors, air could not reach them, and decay slowed to a crawl. The carbon that had once been part of the air stayed trapped within their remains. Layer upon layer, year upon year, the forests buried their own past under their roots, and with every burial, the sky grew a little lighter in carbon, a little heavier in oxygen. It was a simple rhythm, but one that rewrote the planet's story. Less carbon returned to the air, more oxygen lingered. The atmosphere became an echo of this imbalance, one that built upon itself with every passing age. The forests did not know it, but they had become a vast living pump, pulling carbon down and pushing oxygen up. The effect was slow but relentless. Across millions of years, the composition of the air drifted upward. Oxygen began to fill more of each breath, each gust of wind, each drop of rain. The oceans responded, their surfaces fizzing with new chemistry as gases dissolved and escaped again. The line between land and sky blurred, both sharing in the same transformation. With more oxygen came new possibilities. The air became clearer, sound traveled farther, and light scattered differently through the mist. The sky itself seemed brighter. Fires that once struggled to catch now found easy fuel. A single strike of lightning could turn a forest into flame. Rainforests smoldered, burned, and regrew, their life and death feeding the same endless cycle of air and earth. The great oxygen surge was not an event, but a condition, a slow wave rising through time. Every living thing on land was shaped by it. Insects grew larger, their bodies able to draw in oxygen without lungs, their wings wide enough to cast shadows over the swamps. Amphibians crept from the water, their hearts beating faster, their blood carrying more air than before. And still the forests grew. They seemed infinite, a green ocean covering the continents. From the equator to the poles, wherever warmth and moisture gathered, plants took hold. Each leaf was a declaration of chemical rebellion, a statement that life could change the air itself. The more life there was, the more the planet transformed. The atmosphere began to shimmer with excess. Oxygen, that restless element, does not sit still. It reacts, it fuses, it feeds. Rocks weathered faster, iron turned to rust wherever air touched stone. The land took on hues of red and brown, painted by the chemistry of abundance. In every forest, in every storm, the planet's breath was visible, in the glow of embers, in the gleam of dew, in the thin blue haze that hung over the horizon, and above it all, lightning danced. Thunderstorms were constant companions of this new earth, their flashes igniting the air, Fires became frequent visitors, shaping the landscape as much as water and wind once had. The jungles burned, but they also thrived. The flames cleared ground for new growth, released nutrients into the soil, and made room for diversity to bloom. In this cycle of fire and renewal, the planet found balance again, though of a different kind. Oxygen no longer drifted upward unchecked. It was constantly consumed and replaced, burned and born anew. Life had created not only the means for fire to exist, but the means for fire to sustain the world. The air that wrapped the earth during this time was unlike any before or since. It was dense, reactive, alive with invisible energy. Creatures breathed deeply, their bodies quickened by abundance. Even decay became faster, sharper, more complete when air could reach it. The planet's metabolism had accelerated, but abundance carries weight. As oxygen climbed higher, each breath became both gift and risk. The line between life and destruction narrowed. The forests that made the air rich also lived at the mercy of their own creation. A single spark, a single dry season, could turn paradise into smoke, yet still they grew. Still they built the atmosphere that would one day challenge them. When the air itself grows eager, storms arrive with different hands. Lightning no longer simply carved the sky, it awakened it. Each spark struck a world already primed, where oxygen had grown restless in its abundance. The forests that once exhaled serenity now stood inside a chemistry that trembled on the edge of flame. Every breath of wind carried potential, a thin, invisible tension between life and ignition. Moist leaves no longer promised safety. Rain cooled the bark, but not the reaction waiting beneath it. Fire no longer needed drought or neglect. It only needed a moment. The sky had become a conductor, and lightning its instrument. Each storm sang across the horizon in chains of light, lacing the canopy below with fire. What began as a flash became an orchestra of burning, trunks that split with a hiss, branches collapsing in waves, leaves vaporizing into brief clouds of steam. Moisture could delay combustion, but not deny it. The air's hunger was too deep, too simple, too certain. To stand among those jungles would have been to feel the atmosphere itself alive with tension. The air smelled metallic, charged with ions and the faint sweetness of burning resin. Mist gathered in the hollows, glowing orange as fires passed in the distance. The trees rose like pillars in a smoky cathedral, their crowns vanishing into haze. When the fire came, it did not crawl. It moved like weather, a sweeping pulse of heat that leapt rivers and climbed the trunks of lycopsids, as if the forest itself were breathing flame. And yet the world did not end. It adjusted. Fire, though fierce, became part of the rhythm. Plants learned to rise again from ash. Some species spread spores that opened only when touched by heat, their life depending on the very thing that consumed them. The forest floor was reborn after every blaze, a cycle of black and green, of smoke and sprout. In time, the planet began to record its own burn marks. Charcoal fell like dark snow, layering itself into sediments that would one day harden into coal seams. Each stratum told a story of combustion, leaves reduced to glassy fragments, branches flash sealed in time. Those streaks still lie buried in stone, the fingerprints of a planet that burned almost continuously. Seen from far above, Earth must have glowed. Continents shimmered with ribbons of orange that flared and faded across the night side. Smoke softened the edges of daylight, tinting the air in muted gold. The line between firelight and sunlight blurred. Oxygen had become the planet's hidden accelerant, making every storm a test, every spark an act of creation. Chemistry ruled the age. The air's generosity had turned volatile. Oxygen, so graceful in its gift of breath, also held a craving, the drive to join with carbon, to release energy stored in wood and leaf. Each fire was sunlight freed again, a delayed echo of photosynthesis. Life burned its own handiwork and began anew from the ashes. In this strange balance, the planet pulsed like a lung. Forests grew faster than fire could consume them, and fire returned the favor by clearing the way for growth. Spores and seeds rode columns of warm air, scattering to untouched wetlands where new jungles rose. The Carboniferous world did not resist its own burning, it danced with it. Insects filled the haze, their wings catching sparks of light as they skimmed through the glowing air. Amphibians crept among smoldering roots, thriving in the warmth that lingered after storms. Even decay took on new speed. Bacteria and fungi worked tirelessly, recycling what the flames had left behind. The planet's metabolism quickened. Each fire was both an ending and a renewal. The ash it left behind enriched the soil, turning blackened clearings into nurseries for new life. The forests that returned were denser, darker, and more complex, built not in defiance of fire, but in cooperation with it. Bark thickened, spores grew resistant, and roots dug deeper. Life learned to weave itself into flame, to rise from its own destruction with quiet mastery. The carboniferous glow never faded completely. Fires continued to crawl across continents, illuminating the humid night like threads of molten veins. Heat and smoke altered the air again, feeding storms that called lightning back. It was a self-sustaining rhythm, a song of heat, breath, and renewal. And through it all, life endured. It did not shrink from the hazard it had made. It adapted to it, sculpted by chemistry into forms that could thrive amid volatility. The charcoal beneath our feet is its memory, a black archive of forests reborn again and again, of air too alive to rest. The world had entered its brightest and most dangerous harmony. The air itself had learned to burn, and the planet burned with it, not as a tragedy, but as proof that creation sometimes needs its own undoing. The air was heavy with power. Each breath carried more than life. It carried potential. The forests of the Carboniferous stood beneath skies richer in oxygen than any the planet had ever known. Within that dense atmosphere, the boundaries of size began to soften. What had once been small learned to stretch, and what had once been delicate grew vast. The world shimmered beneath a canopy of green light and gold mist. Beneath the towering lycopsids and horsetails, creatures stirred that would seem like myths to us now. They were not dinosaurs, but giants born of air and leaf, the first rulers of the breathable world. Above the still swamps, enormous dragonflies glided through shafts of filtered light. Their wings stretched wider than a human arm, transparent as thin glass, and veined like the surface of a river. Each movement was deliberate, slow, and powerful. They drifted between tree trunks like fragments of living glass, their bodies banded in bronze and shadow. The air around them quivered with their passing, though the sound was no louder than wind in reeds. When one settled, it was like a machine designed by nature, angles and symmetry catching the shimmer of wet leaves. The creature's compound eyes reflected the forest in countless fragments, each lens showing a slightly different world. To see through them would be to glimpse the Carboniferous from every angle at once, glowing, humid, alive. Below, the forest floor moved. A slow ripple crossed the ground as Arthroplora, the giant millipede of that age, made its unhurried procession through the ferns. It stretched nearly 8 feet long, its armor divided into glistening plates that overlapped like the roof of a temple, every joint flexed with quiet precision. As it advanced, the earth sank beneath its weight, and the undergrowth trembled. It needed no speed. Its size alone was defense enough. In this world, air itself was a kind of engine. The atmosphere carried so much oxygen that movement, flight, and breath demanded less effort. Insects no longer struggled for air, they lived inside it. Every cell was bathed in fuel, Every motion came easier, energy filled the smallest tissues, and creatures simply grew into the opportunities surrounding them. The forest had become a cathedral of motion. Wings brushed against hanging ferns, water pooled beneath roots, reflecting the silhouettes of the great dragonflies as they circled overhead. Even the light seemed heavier, diffused through mist and spore clouds. The soundscape deepened, the steady creak of movement, the slow percussion of armored legs, the whisper of large wings parting the air. The dragonflies hunted by sight, their vast eyes sensing flickers invisible to slower creatures. They caught smaller insects mid-flight with precision, their jaws closing silently. Afterward, they perched among the mossy trunks to feed, the glow of sunlight on their wings mingling with the shimmer of the swamp. Arthropleura, the giant below, consumed fallen plants and soft wood, reshaping the forest floor as it crawled. Its passage opened new spaces for growth, turning decay into opportunity. Together, these giants shaped a rhythm, air feeding life, life feeding decay, decay feeding the next rise of green. All around, the air shimmered with abundance. The creatures of this era did not understand their size as privilege. It was simply how the world was built. The atmosphere gave them reach and strength beyond measure, and so they lived as the physical echoes of the planet's deep breath. And yet that breath carried fragility with it. The same chemistry that fed wings also fed fire. The same oxygen that lifted giants could ignite forests with a spark. Their grandeur existed only within that narrow balance, a fleeting window when air and life stood in rare harmony. They were creatures of a temporary miracle, evolution sculpted by atmosphere, sustained by luck. Still, the Carboniferous world thrived. The air pulsed with movement, and every sound seemed layered with presence. Dragonflies glided through rising heat. Rain slid across armored carapaces. Beneath the canopy, the earth steamed, alive with microbes and the slow turning of roots. Even the fires that smoldered in hidden hollows became part of the rhythm, burning quietly beneath the surface while life rebuilt itself above. To walk there would have been to witness power without cruelty, a calm, immense vitality shaped entirely by breath. The giants of this time were not symbols of dominance, but of atmosphere. They lived as extensions of the air itself, their bodies tracing the invisible energy that surrounded them. And as the forests deepened and the air grew richer still, the balance held. The age of giants had begun, and every flutter of wing, every ripple of carapace, was the sound of the planet breathing too deeply and loving the result. The air was alive. It shimmered in the heat of the Carboniferous world, thick with oxygen and heavy to breathe. It fed the fires that danced through forests, the trees that rose again from the ashes, and the creatures that filled the swamps with quiet motion. Yet its generosity was selective. The same air that let some grow immense would have been too fierce for others to endure. Insects were the favored ones. The great dragonflies and giant millipedes of that time owed their enormity not to strength or muscle, but to the elegance of their design. They were creatures of simplicity, shaped by a world that breathed for them. In their bodies ran no blood carrying hemoglobin, no lungs drawing breath through effort. Instead, small openings dotted their sides, spiracles leading to networks of fine tubes called trachea. Through these, oxygen drifted straight into their tissues. It was a system of quiet precision. Air did not need to be pulled in. It wandered freely, following the gradient of abundance. When oxygen filled more than a third of the atmosphere, diffusion reached deeper and faster than ever before. Every cell, every fiber of muscle received what it needed without strain. In a sense, the insects did not breathe the air breathed them. Their world was one of effortless motion. Wings beat with the light rhythm of abundance. Bodies grew broad and long, their weight carried by the very medium that surrounded them. A dragonfly of that age might have stretched its wings half a meter across, gliding through green mist in perfect stillness. Beneath it, the ground trembled under the passage of Arthropleura, a creature as long as a man, its armor shining with moisture as it moved between the roots of ancient trees. For these beings, air was freedom, but for vertebrates, it would have been peril. Our lungs, intricate and deliberate, draw in air and pass it to blood that must regulate what it receives. That precision keeps us alive, but it also binds us to narrow limits. Too much oxygen, and the very chemistry that sustains us turns against us. The molecule that fuels life is also one of nature's most reactive forces. Inside living cells, oxygen does more than nourish, it oxidizes. In abundance, it creates unstable compounds that strike at membranes and DNA, corroding life from within. This invisible damage, called oxidative stress, would have been relentless in such a world. To breathe that atmosphere would be to invite a slow burning. The body's own metabolism turned volatile. In that age, we could not have walked among the swamps without harm. Each breath would carry more oxygen than our blood could safely bear. The lungs would overfill, the tissues inflamed by their own chemistry. Where insects found power, vertebrates would have found exhaustion. Life had divided itself by design, each form tuned to the air it was born into. The Carboniferous forests belonged to those who could live lightly. The air was their element, not just around them, but within them. Insects drifted through the haze like moving fragments of light. Mayflies, beetles, and early cockroaches filled the dim canopy, while larger forms traced their slow orbits above the swamp. Beneath the roots, amphibians hid in the water's edge, smaller, slower, waiting for dusk when the heat fell away. Each species carried the same legacy of air, but their fates were written differently. The insects thrived in it. They filled every layer of the forest, from the highest fronds to the shadows below. The sound of their wings became part of the landscape, a low, steady hum that joined the drip of water and the hiss of distant fire. Every motion, every flutter was made possible by the world's breath. Yet this age of lightness was not built to last. The very gift that had shaped them was fragile. When oxygen began to fall, the diffusion that once powered their size could no longer keep pace. Their tracheae reached the same distances, but the air carried less to give. The giants began to dwindle, their lineages shrinking back toward the scale that physics and atmosphere allowed. For a time, though, the world was theirs. To stand beneath the high canopy and watch a Meganura descend would be to see air made visible, a creature so vast yet so effortless that it seemed carved from the wind itself. Its wings caught glimmers of light, scattering them like scales of glass. Below, Arthropleura moved in the half-dark, a glistening procession of armor and motion. Each was a monument to abundance, living proof of what air could sculpt when it overflowed with possibility. In that ancient stillness, the atmosphere was not merely a backdrop. It was the sculptor, the architect, the unseen hand shaping every form. Each breath the forest exhaled became part of their design. Oxygen built their wings, their strength, their dominion, but it also built their boundaries. The Carboniferous had revealed a truth that life would never forget. Abundance is a double-edged gift. Too little, and existence starves. Too much, and even breath becomes flame. Between those edges lies the narrow space where balance endures, the space we now inhabit, where each inhale sustains but never burns. In that long-vanished world, the air had chosen its champions. They were creatures of wind and light, built not for conquest, but for the grace of survival in perfect chemistry. Beneath the trees that fed them, they ruled a living dream of motion and silence, never knowing how briefly the gift would last. The air had made them giants, and when it thinned, it took its miracles back. Yet the memory of that abundance lingers, in fossils, in the fine veins of wings pressed into stone, and in the quiet truth that life and air have always shared the same breath. The jungles of the Carboniferous breathed like living lungs. Mist coiled between the trees, soft and luminous in the filtered light. Beneath the canopies, life crept and crawled, every motion a small spark of chemistry made possible by the air itself. The world was rich with oxygen, and everything that lived within it pulsed faster, burned brighter, and moved with quiet intensity. But abundance brings its own kind of weight. The great arthropods ruled these forests, and their bodies gleamed with layers of chitin, armored and jointed like clockwork. They were creatures of rhythm, slow when they wished, fast when they needed. The ground trembled faintly under their movement, a reminder that life had grown large, bold, and unafraid. Yet even in a world so generous with air, survival had its limits. Predators, especially, felt the strain of that generosity. High oxygen filled every living system with energy, fueling metabolism beyond anything the planet had seen before. But with that speed came heat. Each breath turned to fire inside the body, warming it past comfort. For the great hunters of the Carboniferous, the challenge was not just to catch prey, it was to avoid burning out from within. The smaller creatures thrived easily. They could rest in the cool dampness of the forest floor, their bodies quick and light. But for those that hunted, for the dragonflies that ruled the skies, for the centipede-like giants that pursued prey through roots and shadow, every chase was a risk. Movement meant heat, and heat meant danger. To run for too long, to fly too far, was to flirt with collapse. The same oxygen that made their muscles powerful could overwhelm them with the intensity of their own metabolism. Unlike the vertebrates that would come millions of years later, these creatures had no way to regulate their temperature. They could not sweat or pant. The only relief came from stillness, from the cool breath of shade and moisture that rose from the swamp. So evolution turned cunning. Predators began to change, not in body alone, but in behavior. They learned patience. They became stalkers, not sprinters. The forest floor became their camouflage, a tapestry of shadows and fallen leaves, where they could wait in silence for movement. Some blended with bark, others buried themselves in the mud, their armored plates rising from the soil like fragments of the earth itself. When prey passed close, they struck with precision. Speed no longer came from endurance, but from surprise. Muscles coiled with oxygen's energy, then released it all at once in a burst of power. The moment after, they would retreat again to the cool, letting the heat of motion fade. In this world, ambush was evolution's answer to abundance. Predators grew efficient, their bodies tuned for stillness and short, decisive action. The cycle of hunting shifted from the chase to the strike, from pursuit to patience. The atmosphere had given them strength, but it had also demanded restraint. Even in the air, the same dilemma unfolded. The giant dragonflies could glide for hours, their wide wings cutting through the mist, but when they hunted, they relied on the quiet economy of motion. They watched from above, sensing vibrations in the wind, then folded their wings and dove. Each attack was brief, perfect, and final, the only way to hunt without overheating. The forests themselves shaped this behavior. Their humidity trapped warmth, their shadows offered refuge. The water that pooled between roots became both mirror and hiding place. Creatures adapted to this balance, moving between cool darkness and bursts of sunlight, between stillness and frenzy. In this equilibrium of power, no creature could dominate for long. The air was too rich, the heat too constant. Every advantage demanded a cost. The very chemistry that made their size possible also limited their freedom. The planet seemed to whisper its rules: move too quickly, and you will burn. Life listened. It adjusted, Some species grew thinner, lighter, better able to release heat. Others grew heavier, their armor trapping moisture to cool their inner workings. Every adaptation was a negotiation with the air, a response to the invisible fire that filled their lungs. Through this slow refinement, the predators of the Carboniferous became masters of precision. They learned that survival did not belong to the fastest, but to the most patient, those who could hold their energy, release it only when the world offered its chance, then fade again into silence. In the still hours of twilight, the forest would come alive with the quiet choreography of these hunters. A ripple in the water, a whisper among the ferns, a brief gleam of chitin catching the last light. Every motion was deliberate, every pause heavy with purpose. The world no longer belonged to those who could move the fastest, but to those who could endure the heat of their own vitality. The air had given them strength, yet demanded grace in return, and so, beneath the towering trees and endless humidity, life learned patience. It learned that too much of a good thing could burn, and that even in a world built on abundance, survival required restraint. The predators adapted to the air that fueled them, finding balance between fire and breath, between hunger and stillness. The forest remained their home, their battlefield, their refuge, and the planet itself continued to watch, breathing deeply through its endless jungles, unaware that this delicate equilibrium would not last forever. The world had learned to breathe, and now it was breathing too much. The Carboniferous forests stretched across the continents, a boundless continent of green and shadow. Trees rose in shimmering ranks, their crowns fading into mist, their roots lost in dark water. The air was warm and wet, rich with the scent of resin, mud, and life turning slowly to decay. Yet beneath all that beauty, balance had begun to falter. The trees grew without restraint. They climbed higher, spread wider, and fell faster than the planet could reclaim them. Each trunk that toppled into the swamp carried away a portion of carbon that once drifted through the air. For millions of years, the rhythm had been simple. What lived would die, and through decay, the air would be replenished. But in these endless swamps, that rhythm began to slow. The waters were too deep, the air too rich, and the decay too weak. Fungi and bacteria, the unseen engines that broke the fallen into soil, began to fail. The oxygen that filled the air so generously turned against them, making their work unstable and brief. When the remains of trees met the wet earth, they did not fully return to the sky. Some burned where fires touched them, the rest sank into silence. The planet had wandered into excess. With every passing season, more carbon vanished underground, sealed beneath layers of mud and water. More oxygen remained aloft, feeding both flame and growth. The forests were unknowingly writing their own record, a slow, dark library of buried breath. The earth was trapping its own exhale. Beneath the roots, time thickened. Layers of fallen vegetation pressed together, compacted by centuries of weight. The material was spongy and black, heavy with the scent of trapped life. In time, those layers would harden into coal, the fossilized story of an atmosphere that had outgrown its restraint. But in this moment, the swamps were alive, their every leaf a lung, their every shadow an engine for air. The sky swelled with their breath. Each sunrise filled the world with a light too soft to name. The air shimmered in gold and haze, alive with invisible motion. Oxygen thickened the atmosphere, feeding the flames that scoured old forests and the creatures that thrived in new ones. The line between creation and destruction blurred until it was only chemistry. It was a feedback too quiet to hear, too vast to stop. The more the forests grew, the more oxygen they released. The more oxygen filled the air, the harder it became for decay to reclaim what was lost. Fire became constant, a pulse of light sweeping through the jungles, yet never enough to balance what the swamps buried. Rain carried ash and nutrients back to the roots, and the cycle began again. Growth fed fire, and fire fed growth until the system no longer answered to control. The earth was over-breathing. To stand at the edge of those wetlands would have been to feel life itself pressing outward. The air would hum softly, thick and electric with unseen energy. Beneath your feet, the ground would shift and sigh, releasing bubbles of gas from the deep, slow decay of ancient trunks. The air would taste metallic, sweet and damp, the flavor of a planet drunk on its own vitality. Above, trees stood like pillars of light, their trunks silvered by mist, their crowns glinting with moisture. Sunlight poured through leaves and broken columns, catching the drifting spores that filled the air like fine green dust. The sound of rain would fall without rhythm, absorbed instantly by the living sponge of the forest floor. In that deep quiet, the planet's breath was constant and unbroken. The balance had tipped, though no living thing could sense it. The air that had once sustained life was beginning to alter the world beneath it. Minerals in the soil turned red as they met oxygen's hunger. Stones cracked, metals tarnished, and oceans drew the sky's chemistry into their depths. Molecule by molecule, the planet was rewriting itself. Still, the forests continued to grow. Each seed that fell, each spore that drifted, carried the same simple command to rise toward the light. There was no awareness, no hesitation, only the endless patience of photosynthesis. Trees lived, died, and sank again, feeding the air that fed them, each generation building on the silence of the last. The earth's breathing had no enemy, no malice, only momentum. It was life fulfilling its own promise, unaware that it was laying down the foundations of imbalance. Beneath the calm surface of water and mist, the chemistry of the planet was changing direction, moving toward a threshold that could not be reversed. And in that stillness, surrounded by trunks older than memory, the world inhaled too deeply. The forests did not know what they had begun. They only grew, reaching ever higher into the bright living air, exhaling into the storm that would one day come to claim them. The world had become its own engine. From the swamps of the Carboniferous, life and fire wove together into a single rhythm, one pulse feeding the next. The forests grew without end, rising from the buried remains of earlier generations. The air above shimmered with oxygen so rich that every spark felt alive, waiting. The planet was breathing faster than ever, and in that breath something caught fire. It began quietly, as great changes often do. Rain fell on soft black soil, and from it, new trees lifted their fronds into the mist. Each leaf unfurled like a promise, pulling in carbon from the air, sending oxygen back to the sky. Light, air, and water joined in balance, and for a time it seemed endless, but each breath of growth carried consequence. The more life filled the land, the richer the air became. The richer the air, the easier it was to burn. Lightning began to find the forests with uncanny ease. A single flash could ignite miles of green. Fires swept through the ferns, climbed the trunks of lycopsids, and leapt from canopy to canopy. The flames did not destroy, they renewed, they passed like wind, clearing the forest floor, freeing nutrients from the dead, and scattering ash across the wetlands in drifts of silver gray. When the rains returned, the ash sank into the mud, turning it fertile. New trees grew taller in the space where others had fallen, each one drinking sunlight and exhaling life. The fires fed the soil fed the forest fed the air, and the air, eager with oxygen, waited again for the next spark. Fire fed life fed air fed fire again. The loop was complete. It was an age of unstoppable abundance, a world that refused stillness. Every process magnified another. Growth summoned flame, Flame cleared ground for new growth, and the sky above thickened with the breath of forests that would not rest. The chemistry of life itself had become a mirror of excess. The fires were everywhere. They came not from drought or desolation, but from chemistry, from the air's own appetite. Even damp wood could smolder when lightning struck. Even green leaves could flare under the right breath of wind. Across the swamps, smoke and mist rose together, two halves of the same cycle. When the burning stopped, silence returned. Rain fell in heavy drops, hissing against the steaming ground. The air smelled of ash and wet earth, sharp and clean, and from the blackened soil, shoots of green broke through once more. The forests never waited long. Within days, life covered the scars of fire, turning char to chlorophyll, embers to leaf. Decay could not keep up. The tiny decomposers that once balanced the cycle, the fungi and microbes that broke the fallen into soil, struggled in this high oxygen air. Where they faltered, the planet buried its own remains. Layer after layer of carbon sank into the mud, trapped beneath rising forests. The fires that scorched the surface only deepened the imbalance, leaving behind soil richer than before and air even more eager to burn. The planet's hunger was not for destruction, but for creation without rest. It built faster than it could break down, exhaling more than it could reclaim. Earth was young, learning its chemistry, testing the limits of what life could do when nothing held it back. To walk through those forests would have been to feel that restlessness in the air itself. The atmosphere would press gently on the skin, tasting faintly metallic, alive, the scent of sap mixed with the ghost of smoke. Beneath the green hush, faint crackles lingered, the sound of a world always between burning and renewal. Even the creatures moved to this rhythm. Dragonflies the size of birds glided through smoky sunlight, their wings flashing in the red glow of distant flame. Amphibians crept among the charred stumps, their slick skins steaming in the heat left behind. Plants began to depend on the very thing that once threatened them, releasing spores that opened only after fire's kiss. Each blaze left behind its own memory. Charcoal settled into the mud, later pressed into seams of black stone. Millions of years later, these layers would become the record of an Earth that once lived too quickly, a planet that could not stop inhaling its own creation. Those seams of coal and ash are time's quiet handwriting, the signature of forests that burn to feed themselves. Yet even within that storm of combustion, beauty thrived. The jungles glowed gold at dawn, the mist heavy with life's breath. Each new forest rose brighter, denser, more alive than the one before it. Fire and life moved in harmony, each shaping the other, each unwilling to rest. For a long time, the balance held, fragile but unbroken. But every cycle that climbs must one day bend. Each new tree drew in more carbon, each leaf added more oxygen, and the sky shimmered under the growing weight of its own generosity. The same air that fed the forests also made them perilous. The same chemistry that gave life its flame now made the world burn too easily. The earth had become both paradise and warning. In the deep breath of the Carboniferous, creation and combustion were one. Every forest was a spark waiting to happen, every flame a promise of rebirth. Life had made the air abundant, and in doing so, it had lit the slow fire that would one day force the planet to learn restraint. The air was alive, almost too alive. At the height of the Carboniferous world, every breath carried a brightness that seemed eternal. Oxygen filled the skies, thick and reactive, a clear invisible flame that touched everything. The forests thrived in its glow, fires fed upon it, and the great insects glided through it as if carved from the air itself. Yet deep within the smallest chambers of living cells, that same abundance began to reveal its hidden edge. Oxygen has always been a paradox, gentle and perilous in equal measure. It is the breath of life, but also the slow hand of decay. When it meets the chemistry of the living, it burns softly, unseen, drawing energy from the quiet fire within. Every movement, every heartbeat, every thought depends on that reaction, the controlled oxidation of sugar and air. But when the world grew too rich in oxygen, that control began to slip. The fire spread inward where no flame should go. Inside the tissues of animals, the balance trembled. The molecules that once sustained life began to wander, colliding in ways nature had not prepared for. Each collision left a trace, a chemical spark that bit into DNA, that scarred membranes and wore at the machinery of life. These were the first stirrings of oxidative stress, a silent storm unfolding within. It did not rage or roar, it whispered quiet and endless, a chemistry of wear. Creatures that had once thrived began to feel the strain. The change was not dramatic. It arrived slowly, invisibly, like time itself. Bodies aged faster, lifespans shortened, and tissues once vibrant, dulled with unseen corrosion. The same oxygen that had powered strength and speed was now carving its own faint scars into the living world. Each breath became a negotiation between energy and endurance. For small creatures, this balance was easier to hold. Insects breathed not with lungs, but with tiny channels that opened directly into their bodies, and the air's excess was dispersed rather than concentrated. But for larger beings, the first amphibians crawling through this damp and luminous world, the chemistry became harder to contain. Their blood burned with oxygen's power, and with it came a price. Yet even in this quiet trial, life adapted. Within the cells of these early creatures, new defenses began to stir. Enzymes appeared, intricate and swift, capable of calming the rogue reactions that oxygen unleashed. They hunted the reactive fragments before they could do harm, binding and neutralizing them. These were the ancestors of the antioxidants that still protect every living being today, invisible guardians born from necessity, but not all could keep pace. In the heavy air of the Carboniferous, evolution rewarded resilience and punished haste. Some species faltered. Their bodies aged before they could reproduce. Their eggs oxidized before they could hatch. The very air that had nourished their ancestors now eroded their future. The line between abundance and collapse had become impossibly thin. The forests above carried on unaware. Their leaves drank in carbon and poured out oxygen as if generosity were endless. The balance had tilted, but the trees did not know. Beneath their vast canopies, life rewrote itself molecule by molecule, finding new ways to endure what the planet had made. Cells began to include repair within their design, as if the earth itself had whispered the lesson that perfection was no longer possible, only persistence. For the first time, the atmosphere had become more than a gift. It was a challenge, shaping every living thing that drew it in. Oxygen had once been a quiet byproduct of photosynthesis. Now it ruled the rhythm of existence. It filled the world with clarity and color, but also with fragility. The breath of life had turned into something that tested its own creation. This was not destruction, but refinement. The chemistry of life had begun to fold resilience into its very pattern. Proteins twisted into protectors. Genes learned to repair what oxygen broke, and evolution learned patience. To survive abundance, life had to learn moderation. Every species became a reflection of this tension, thriving in the air that could one day undo it. Still, the air shimmered with vitality. The forests glowed beneath the sun's light, the sky bluer than any we have ever seen. To breathe in that world would have felt like inhaling light itself, pure, endless, alive. Yet within that brilliance, the cost was already written. The cells of living things bore the first faint traces of wear. tiny scars that spoke of oxygen's double nature. Energy and decay, creation and erosion, all shared a single breath. Life had not turned away from the danger, it had embraced it. In every creature, defenses hummed quietly, repairing what they could, accepting what they must. The earth had reached a turning point not of ruin, but of understanding, that to live with oxygen was to live in balance with something that could never be fully tamed. And still the trees reached higher, still the air grew bright. The cycle of breath and flame continued, unaware that within its perfection lay the seed of mortality. The world had filled itself with too much of a good thing, and life had learned the cost of abundance, to burn softly, endlessly, in the light that gave it form. The world that had once drowned in green began to dry. It did not happen all at once. The change crept in like the slow retreat of a tide. The air still shimmered with oxygen. The forest still stood high and ancient, but somewhere in the rhythm of the planet, something shifted. The rains that had fed the endless swamps began to fade. Rivers narrowed, lakes shrank, and the heavy air that once carried moisture across continents grew lighter, thinner. The great wetlands, the lungs of the Carboniferous earth, began to wither at their edges. For millions of years, these swamps had been the heart of the planet's breath. They absorbed sunlight, captured carbon, and exhaled oxygen in quantities no age before or since could match. Now, as the climate cooled and the seas withdrew, the great forests found themselves stranded upon drier land. Their roots, once bathed in still waters, reached down into soil that no longer answered with softness. The continents were moving again, slowly colliding into a single vast shape. Pangea, land met land, mountain chains rose, and the balance of the atmosphere shifted with the rise of every peak. Winds changed their paths, ocean currents faltered and found new ones. What had once been a world of humidity and warmth was beginning to fracture into contrasts, wet and dry, fertile and barren. In the thick jungles of the equator, the signs came quietly. Leaves that once glistened with dew began to droop. The sound of rain, that had been constant for eons, came less often, falling in short, fierce storms that vanished into long seasons of heat. The ground hardened, and the shallow pools that mirrored the canopy above began to turn to mud, then to dust. The lycopsids, the towering trees that had built the Carboniferous world, began to falter. Their hollow trunks, once filled with water and strength, grew brittle under the sun. When they fell, they did not sink into swamps to be buried and preserved, but cracked against dry earth. Their decay was faster now, their carbon returning to the air rather than sinking below it. The balance was unraveling. With fewer swamps came fewer forests. With fewer forests came less oxygen. The great breath of the planet, once so deep and full, began to slow. The atmosphere that had once climbed toward 35% oxygen began its long decline. The world was exhaling again, softly, quietly, almost in relief. And with that decline came silence. Fire, which had once ruled the Carboniferous, began to fade. Lightning still flashed across the sky, but the land no longer answered with flame. The forests that remained were damp only in memory. The ground had grown bare, the air less rich. The chemistry that once made even wet leaves burn had passed. It must have been strange, this turning of ages, to see the same forests that once threatened to burn, now struggling to breathe. From the sky, the continents below would have looked changed. The endless green that once covered the equatorial belt was thinning, breaking apart into patches of vegetation and open plain. Swamped by swamp, the world's great engine of photosynthesis was shutting down. The insects that had filled the skies began to vanish. The air that once supported their giant wings no longer held enough oxygen to lift them. The dragonflies that once glided through columns of light now flew closer to the ground, their wings slower, their flight heavier. The great millipedes that once ruled the undergrowth retreated to the dampest shadows, their size shrinking with every generation. The forest's fall was not violent. It was quiet, almost peaceful. The fires that had once been constant no longer returned, and in their absence, the land cooled. The humidity that had made the world shimmer gave way to wind and dust. The air grew clearer, but emptier too. The oxygen that had once been creation's excess now drifted away, absorbed by weathering rock and by the slow return of carbon to the sky. The very fires that once burned too freely now struggled to live. The earth had turned a page in silence, yet not everything was lost. In the last refuges of wetland, pockets of green endured, small, stubborn islands of the old world. Seeds carried by wind found new homes along rivers and deltas. The pulse of photosynthesis continued, quieter but steady, like a heartbeat slowed by exhaustion rather than death. The forests had not truly vanished. They had only fallen asleep, and above them, the atmosphere they had built still lingered, glowing faintly blue in the thinning air. The balance between life and chemistry had begun to shift again as the earth prepared for a different kind of world, one of dryness, of open space, of air too thin for giants. The forests that had once breathed too deeply were now exhaling their final sighs, and the echo of that breath drifted upward, fading slowly into the quiet. The silence came gradually, like the dimming of a great breath. For millions of years, the earth had burned bright, forests rising and falling in rhythms of growth and flame, the air alive with oxygen. But nothing in nature remains boundless. The same forces that had filled the sky began, quietly, to take it back. What had once been a world of abundance was beginning to slow, as if the planet itself had grown weary of its own breath. Oxygen, which had once filled more than a third of the air, began to fade. It happened softly, unseen by the creatures that breathed it. Yet everywhere, the absence could be felt. The great swamps that had fed the sky were drying, their once endless forests thinning into open plains. The buried carbon that had once locked oxygen above the clouds was now dwindling. The balance was tilting back, and the earth's lungs began at last to exhale. The drop was not a single moment, but a long and quiet unraveling. Over several million years, brief in the language of stone, oxygen fell to nearly half its former height. The air that had once kindled even damp wood could no longer hold a steady flame. Lightning still struck the ground, but fires sputtered out in the heavy, moisture-laden air. The jungles, which had once pulsed with renewal after each blaze, grew dim. Ash no longer fed the soil. Decay returned to stillness. The world had grown still, and the stillness carried weight. The insects were the first to feel it. Once they had ruled the air, their wings shimmering through misty sunlight, their bodies vast and light as breath. Now the sky no longer carried them so easily. The air had become thinner, its lift reduced, its generosity withdrawn. With every generation they grew smaller, their flight slower, their world more confined. The dragonflies that once spanned the width of a hand now barely covered a palm. The great millipedes that had moved through the undergrowth like living armor vanished, unable to sustain their size in a world that no longer fed such extravagance. It was an extinction without thunder, a soft ending written in air. No impact, no fire, no sudden ruin, only the slow retreat of possibility as the atmosphere shed its excess and demanded restraint. Yet in this silence, something new was stirring. Along the damp edges of what remained of the swamps, small reptiles crept between fallen trunks. Their scales glinted beneath the fading light, their movements measured, deliberate. They carried within them an invention that the insects never could: lungs, muscles that drew breath with purpose, that could pull air inward even when it resisted. Where insects depended on abundance, these new creatures depended on control. The air no longer offered its gift freely, it had become a test, and in that test, the reptiles found their strength. They moved farther from the water, across ground that was drier and colder than their ancestors had known. Their lungs worked steadily, their blood holding oxygen longer, deeper. They could travel beyond the wetlands, into places where the air grew thin and the sun burned low. Evolution had shifted again, quietly, without drama, trading scale for subtlety, abundance for endurance. The forests that remained stood sparse and open, their leaves smaller, their shadows less deep. Where once the world had glowed beneath a canopy of green haze, it now opened to a sharper, bluer light. The humidity faded, and the air grew cool. Fires came less often, and when they did, they smoldered weakly, leaving behind the scent of charcoal instead of clouds of smoke. The atmosphere had learned restraint. Creatures adapted in kind: slower breaths, tighter rhythms, measured movements. Energy had become precious, life could no longer afford waste. The dragonflies now hovered close to the water's edge, their wings beating faster to hold them aloft. The great millipedes were gone, their armored bodies pressed into the dark seams beneath the soil, becoming the very coal that would one day tell their story. Above them, the reptiles spread, quiet architects of the coming age. They laid eggs with shells that sealed out the air, carrying life farther from the swamps than any creature had before. It was not a time of loss, but of adjustment. The world was learning moderation. The atmosphere that once fueled excess had turned toward balance, and every creature followed suit. Forests no longer burned endlessly. The air no longer fanned their fires into fever. What had once been abundance had become precision. The great oxygen crash came not with violence, but with calm. There were no meteors, no volcanic veils of ash, only the slow turning of the planet's chemistry, a long, quiet conversation between air and life. The oxygen that had once made the world flammable had learned patience. Its rhythm slowed, its fire cooled. The earth had exhaled, and in doing so had discovered endurance. In the pale stillness that followed, the world seemed to rest. The forests whispered softly in the wind, smaller but steadier. The skies were clearer, the fires fewer. Beneath them, the reptiles moved with quiet certainty through the cooling light. The age of giants had passed, and in its place something subtler had begun, a world that no longer lived in excess but in balance. The earth had learned to breathe again, this time with care. When the air thinned, the world did not end. It adapted. The forests had fallen silent, the fires had dimmed, and the great insects that once ruled the skies were gone. But in the quiet that followed, the earth began to invent again. Every breath, every heartbeat became an act of refinement. Evolution, patient and tireless, began to reshape life for a world that could no longer rely on abundance. The animals that survived the great oxygen crash were not the largest or the strongest, but the ones most capable of change. In the cooling air, smaller bodies thrived. They needed less oxygen, moved with less effort, and carried within them the seeds of new design. The planet had drawn back its generosity, and life answered with ingenuity. Beneath the surface of this new world, something extraordinary was unfolding. Within the bodies of creatures that crept and crawled and hunted in the dusk, evolution was rebuilding the art of breathing. The first lungs, once simple sacs of air, became more intricate, folded into chambers that could extract more from less. Tiny blood vessels wove themselves closer to those inner walls, shortening the distance between air and life. The heartbeat, that silent rhythm of survival, grew stronger and more efficient. With each generation, the line between survival and suffocation shifted in favor of adaptation. Insects had ruled when oxygen was everywhere, their bodies open to the air through a lacework of tubes. They had no need to carry breath within them, the world did that for them. But now the world had changed, and only those who could manage their own air would endure. Early amphibians felt this pressure first. Their skin, once a breathing organ of its own, began to lose its power in the drier air. To survive, they turned inward. Muscles around their throats and ribs began to contract, pulling air into their bodies instead of waiting for it to seep in. They became masters of shallow breath, learning to fill their lungs with intention. And in the shadows of those wetlands, the reptiles began to rise. They were small at first, scaled against the heat, cautious in movement, but each one carried a quiet revolution inside. Their lungs were no longer soft and shapeless. They were built like bellows, capable of drawing in air and holding it longer. Their hearts pumped with greater precision, dividing blood more efficiently between oxygenated and unoxygenated streams. For the first time, air became not just a condition of life, but a skill to master. Within their blood, another secret evolved. Hemoglobin, the red molecule of breath, learned to hold oxygen more tightly, delivering it where it was most needed. Every heartbeat became an economy of survival, no wasted breath, no idle pulse. The air no longer dictated what size a creature could be. It now determined how cleverly it could endure. In this new balance, size gave way to strategy. The giants had vanished, and in their place came precision. Evolution began to trade bulk for complexity, creating bodies that were not merely sustained by oxygen, but tuned by it. The thinner air demanded thought, control, efficiency. It was here, in this restrained world, that the blueprint for the future was written. The reptiles that learned to breathe deeply would one day give rise to creatures that could run for hours, hunt with endurance, and keep their bodies warm from the inside. The foundation of warm-blooded life began not in abundance, but in scarcity. Across the continents of the forming Pangaea, the earth grew harsher. The days were hot, the nights cold, but for those that survived, the air itself became a teacher. Every breath was a lesson in resilience. Every cell learned to use what little oxygen it had with care. Those that could not faded. Those that could evolved into something new. In this slower world, where fires had vanished and winds carried dust instead of ash, life was perfecting the art of balance. The atmosphere had changed, but so too had the meaning of breath. No longer a luxury, it became precision. Inside the bodies of reptiles, amphibians, and the early ancestors of mammals, evolution refined the machinery of endurance. Capillaries grew narrower, hearts more divided, muscles more specialized. Breath no longer rushed through them, it moved in measured rhythm, each molecule of oxygen accounted for. The very limitations of the air became the fuel of innovation. The creatures that learned to breathe most effectively would inherit the earth. From them would one day come the runners, the thinkers, the warm-blooded dreamers who carried the planet's chemistry in their veins. Oxygen had lost its role as a ruler of size. It had become the architect of complexity, and so, under thinner skies, the earth began to move again. Life no longer chased growth, it chased mastery. The planet that once burned now breathed with restraint, and within that restraint, evolution found its greatest strength, the ability to turn scarcity into possibility and air into wisdom. The world had cooled. The fever that once set the skies ablaze had passed, and in its wake came stillness. The air that had once burned forests and fed the fires of creation was calm now, thinner, subdued. The glow that once traced the horizon in amber and smoke had faded, leaving a planet wrapped in quiet breath. The earth exhaled more slowly. Oxygen had fallen to levels the world had not felt for millions of years. What had once filled a third of the atmosphere now hovered near half that, and the air, once restless with reaction, had grown gentle. Lightning still laced the sky, but its sparks met only damp soil and died there. Rain fell often, heavy and cooling, washing the soot from leaves and stone. The storms no longer roared, they whispered. The forests that endured were darker now. Their trunks stood wrapped in moss, their roots buried in shadow and water. The canopy had thinned, letting light fall in broken pools that wandered across the forest floor. The scent of smoke had vanished, replaced by the deep, cool perfume of rot and earth. The world had entered an age of quiet, an age where the air no longer burned but remembered. Beneath this calm, the ghosts of flame lay hidden. The trees that once towered above the swamps were gone, pressed under layers of mud and stone. Time and pressure worked slowly, turning soft peat to black seams of carbon. Those layers became the planet's memory, the long silent record of a world that once breathed too deeply. Each buried trunk, each compressed fern, was a whisper of a storm long gone. Above, the earth rested. The air was sharp and clean, the sunlight cool and pale. Without the constant breath of burning, the balance had shifted. The skies were clearer, but the warmth had faded. The forests no longer drank carbon from the air in such abundance, and the atmosphere found a new, uneasy stillness. The fires had been the earth's heartbeat, too fast, too wild. Now that pulse had slowed. The quiet was not lifeless, only subdued. Amphibians slid through the cold shallows, their skin gleaming like wet stone. Early reptiles crept along river banks, their scales catching faint light. The insects, once giants, now clung to the low reeds, their wings shorter, their hum quieter. Life went on, but softly. Where once the world had crackled, now it breathed. The sound of burning forests had been replaced by the murmur of wind through reeds, the slow drip of water from branch to soil. The air held the chill of renewal, not the blaze of rebirth, but the cool patience that follows it. The earth seemed to pause, inhaling before the next great shift. Beneath that calm surface, time was working. The buried forests continued their slow transformation, pressed by stone, heated by the deep. The wood became peat, the peat became coal, a fossilized echo of the Carboniferous excess. Each layer of carbon was a captured breath, sealed within rock, storing the energy of sunlight that had once filled the air with oxygen. What had burned was now sleeping, hidden in darkness, waiting for an age that had not yet come. The world above changed with the loss of fire. Ecosystems that had once depended on burning began to fade, replaced by those that thrived in dampness and shadow. Mosses crept across fallen logs, ferns unfurled in the still air, and decay replaced combustion as the planet's quiet alchemy. Carbon sank slowly back into the earth, not as flame but as soil. The great forests of the past had given way to smaller, more deliberate growths, measured, enduring, and cool. In this new balance, the earth had become almost fireproof. The chemistry of the sky no longer encouraged flame, it resisted it. Moisture filled the air, and the heat that once devoured continents was buried far below, locked in the dark seams of coal forming underfoot. The world had learned restraint. If one could have walked those forests, the air would feel heavy and clean, the light pale and unwavering. The trees stood far apart, their shadows stretching long across quiet water. Beneath every step lay the depth of time, the weight of millions of years pressed into silence. The fires had gone out, but their memory endured. Their light, once fierce and consuming, now slept beneath the surface, waiting for something that could awaken it again. The air no longer sparked at the touch of lightning, but it was calm enough to cradle what came next. Oxygen still lingered, just enough to sustain, no longer enough to overwhelm. The world was resting between breaths, the fever of its youth behind it, the long quiet of recovery ahead. And deep below, the memory of its past smoldered faintly in the dark, the buried warmth of a planet that once burned too brightly, now teaching itself to live with its own restraint. The air is not empty, it is a sea so light, we forget we are always swimming in it. Every breath we take is a conversation between the body and that invisible ocean. Molecules drift, collide, and vanish into us, crossing microscopic boundaries that separate the living from the world beyond. It happens in silence, so effortlessly that we rarely notice, yet within that stillness lies one of the oldest and most delicate laws of life, the physics of breathing. Long before lungs, long before the rhythm of chest and diaphragm, life learned how to let the outside world enter. In the earliest days, breathing did not mean drawing air in and pushing it out. It was simpler, gentler, just the meeting of two spaces, one rich in oxygen, the other poor. Nature followed its quiet rule. Air always moves from where it is plentiful to where it is scarce. That is diffusion, the slow, invisible dance of molecules seeking balance. No energy, no effort, no sound, only the patient drift of oxygen from the air into the tissues that need it most. For the insects of ancient Earth, this simple rule was enough. Their bodies were made for it. Tiny openings along their sides, spiracles, led to networks of hollow tubes called tracheae that carried air deep inside them. Through those channels, oxygen diffused directly into their cells. It was an elegant design, light and efficient, perfectly tuned for a small world. But diffusion has its limits. When air molecules must travel farther, their slow drift becomes too weak to sustain life. For small insects, oxygen could reach every cell easily. But as bodies grew larger, that quiet current of molecules could no longer keep pace with the hunger of their tissues. The air inside their tubes grew still, unable to feed what it had once created. This was why the giant insects of the Carboniferous could only exist when oxygen was high. The world itself had done the heavy lifting for them. With 35% oxygen swirling through the air, even the slow crawl of diffusion was enough to fill their bodies. They could grow to impossible sizes because the atmosphere itself carried their breath. But when that abundance faded, so did the luxury of passivity. The world now demanded something new, a way for life to pull the air in, not simply let it wander inside. That change began with pressure. The thin air of the post-Carboniferous world could no longer flow fast enough on its own. Creatures that survived began to use their muscles to draw air in, forcing it into the spaces where diffusion could take over. They turned breathing into an act of motion, into rhythm. The chest rose, the throat tightened, and oxygen was invited inward by force instead of chance. It was the beginning of active breathing. With lungs came a new relationship between biology and physics. The body became a vessel that could shape its own atmosphere. Air entered through the mouth or nostrils, traveling down branching tubes until it reached the alveoli, tiny sacs where air and blood meet. Each one was a miniature world of balance. Oxygen, abundant in the air, slipped across thin membranes into the bloodstream, where its concentration was lower. Carbon dioxide drifted the other way, completing the silent exchange. It was still diffusion, but now guided by design, an alliance between muscle, motion, and molecule. Vertebrates took this partnership further. Their blood became the courier of oxygen, carrying it to every cell through a network of arteries and veins. Inside red blood cells, molecules of hemoglobin clung to oxygen like careful hands, holding it tightly until it reached the tissues that needed it most. What had once been a simple physical process was now a system of rhythm and precision. The lungs drew air in, The heart pushed blood out. Together, they transformed the slow drift of diffusion into a storm of microscopic movement. This, more than size or strength, became the secret of endurance. Where insects could survive only as long as the air allowed, vertebrates could adapt to the air itself. They could climb higher, move faster, and live in places where oxygen was scarce. The physics that once set limits had now become a foundation for innovation. At its core, breathing is still the same conversation it has always been, molecules in motion, seeking balance across the thinnest of boundaries. The lungs, the tracheae, the blood, all are variations on the same quiet principle that life is built on difference. Where oxygen is high and life is low, air will always move to fill the gap. Even now, every breath we take is a small echo of that ancient physics. Air rushes in, fills our lungs, and slips invisibly into our blood. With every exhale, we return what we borrowed, completing the cycle that began long before us. The air we breathe today carries the same oxygen that once drifted into the wings of giant dragonflies and the scales of the first reptiles. The same molecules that once burned forests to ash now cross into our bodies with each heartbeat. The physics of breathing has never changed, only the world around it has. And somewhere, in the quiet space between inhaling and exhaling, we are still connected to that ancient rhythm, the invisible tide of molecules that has carried life forward for more than 500 million years. There is a moment in every flame, quiet, unseen, when breath becomes light. It begins with the same element that fills our lungs. Oxygen, invisible and patient, waits in the air, ready to join with what hungers for release. A spark touches matter, and the molecules that were once bound in stillness begin to break apart, their stored energy spilling outward in color, sound, and heat. Fire, in its simplest truth, is a kind of breathing turned inside out. Both depend on oxygen. Both are controlled forms of reaction. One sustains, the other consumes. The earth has known many kinds of air, and with each shift, the nature of fire itself has changed. When oxygen was low, around 15%, the world was quiet. Flames could exist, but only where the air was perfectly still and the fuel perfectly dry. A campfire in such a world would burn reluctantly, its light dim and orange, its sound soft, its breath labored. Sparks would rise weakly, fading almost at once into darkness. Even dry wood would resist the flame's touch. Fire, like life, would have to fight for every breath. At 21%, the level of oxygen that fills our air today, the balance feels natural. Fires catch easily enough, yet they remain tameable. A match head flares, a candle burns steady, and wood crackles as it releases the sun's ancient energy back into the night. At this concentration, oxygen feeds flame in a rhythm that feels familiar to us, strong enough to sustain, but not so strong as to consume. But in that ancient age when the air held 35% oxygen, fire was something else entirely. It was restless. Even damp leaves could catch flame under the right spark. A single bolt of lightning could ignite miles of forest. The air itself became part of the fire's body, feeding it faster than the earth could restrain. A fallen branch did not smolder. It erupted. The flames roared brighter, whiter, hotter, and the sound of burning filled the air like the breathing of the planet itself. At that concentration, fire was no longer a reaction. It was a state of being. Every breath of wind carried the potential for ignition. The color of the flames shifted toward blue-white, their light sharper, their edges fierce. Heat spread faster, waves of it rolling through the air, turning forests into storms. Even the way sound traveled changed. The crackle became a continuous roar, the air vibrating under the weight of combustion. To understand this is to see oxygen not only as a gas, but as a force that shapes behavior. The concentration of oxygen determines how easily molecules surrender their stored energy, how fiercely bonds break and reform, and how fast heat moves through the air. Fire is simply the visible side of a reaction that happens, invisibly, within every living thing that breathes. Inside us, oxygen fuels the same process, only slower. Each cell burns in silence, transforming sugar into energy, warmth, and motion. We call it metabolism, but it is combustion by another name, a flame held inside, controlled and constant. Fire and breath are reflections of one another, opposites that share a single rule. Too little oxygen, and both fade. Too much, and both spiral beyond control. In a 15% atmosphere, fire is timid. A candle struggles to live. A spark dies almost as soon as it's born. Breathing, too, becomes heavier. The air cannot feed the body as easily. Hearts beat faster, movements slow. Life itself feels muffled, like sound in thick fog. At 21%, everything feels balanced. Fire dances but does not rage. Breath feeds us without danger. The world feels in harmony, as if the air has learned restraint. At 35%, the world becomes bright, wild, and dangerous. Fire needs almost no invitation. It leaps from tree to tree, from lightning to ground, from air to ash. Even the quietest breath would taste of heat and reaction. The balance that makes our modern world feel safe would vanish, replaced by a chemistry always on the edge of ignition. There are no boundaries between these states, only degrees of tension between oxygen and matter. At low oxygen, that tension is weak. At high oxygen, it becomes a thread drawn taut. Fire, like breathing, is balance. Both require oxygen, both release carbon dioxide, both transform the invisible into the visible. In one, energy is captured and stored. In the other, it is set free. When we inhale, our lungs ignite molecules in silence. When a forest burns, the same reaction speaks in light and heat. If you listen closely to a fire, really listen, it sounds almost alive. The crackle and hiss are its heartbeat, the rush of air through its edges, its breath. It consumes, exerts, exhales. The smoke that rises carries the memory of what once was solid, the same way our exhalations carry traces of what we have transformed. Fire is life, inverted. It is the outward face of metabolism, the external echo of what happens within every cell. In the age of high oxygen, Earth's air itself became combustible, a mirror of the living systems it sustained. The planet burned and breathed in the same motion. Each flame was a visible exhale, a reminder that too much vitality can consume itself. Today, the air sits at a quieter balance. Fire still exists, but it waits for permission, a match, a spark, a choice. Breath still sustains, but gently. The world has learned to live within its chemistry, to keep its inner and outer flames in harmony. And yet, in every flicker of light, every sigh of oxygen through our lungs, the memory of that fiery age still lingers, the time when the air itself could burn, and life and fire spoke the same language. The story of that ancient air, the one heavy with oxygen, fire, and breath, is not written in words but in stone. It lingers beneath our feet, layered in the earth's skin, whispered through the patterns of leaves, long turned to rock. The Carboniferous world is gone now, its forests pressed into silence, its creatures reduced to faint outlines no wider than a finger. Yet within those impressions, the air of that age still hums softly, waiting for us to listen. To know that the sky once held 35% oxygen, scientists had to learn to read what cannot be seen. Air leaves no bones, no fossils, no shells, only the traces it shapes in what it touches. Its story is etched into carbon, into fire, into the small geometries of ancient leaves. The first clue is black and fragile, charcoal. It is the still body of flame, the fossil of combustion itself. When lightning struck the swamps of the Carboniferous, it found a world eager to burn. Even damp trees caught fire, and the flames danced across continents thick with ferns and moss. But where the fires were quenched too quickly for the ash to vanish, something remarkable happened. The charred remains, buried and sealed away, hardened into layers of carbon black stone. Those layers now lie scattered across the world, hidden in cliffsides, folded into coal seams, resting deep beneath long, quiet wetlands. They are more than relics of old forests. They are the planet's memory of its own fever. Only in an atmosphere rich enough to feed constant fire could such vast fields of charcoal have formed. Each streak of black rock marks a time when the world breathed too deeply, when the air itself could catch flame. But stone holds other secrets, quieter ones, written in the language of atoms. Every living thing that ever lived on Earth was built from carbon, drawn from the air, shaped by light, and returned again to the wind or soil when life ended. Yet not all carbon is the same. Some atoms are slightly heavier, carrying an extra weight of neutrons. These tiny variations, called isotopes, behave differently as they move through air and life. When plants breathe, they prefer the lighter carbon, leaving behind a signature that time cannot erase. The more plants there are, the more of this light carbon becomes locked away underground. And when that happens, the balance of gases above begins to change. By measuring the ratio of these isotopes in ancient rocks, scientists can trace how the Earth's breath has shifted through the ages. In that record, the Carboniferous Age blazes like a beacon, a drop in carbon dioxide, a surge in oxygen, a planet that had exhaled too much. It is chemistry written not in words, but in weight, the faint imbalance of atoms telling of forests that grew too vast and fires that burned too often. And then there are the leaves. Under the microscope, they speak most softly of all. Pressed flat into shale, their veins form the delicate architecture of a vanished world. But it is the pores, the tiny stomata that once dotted their surfaces, that hold the most intimate record of breath. Through these openings, carbon dioxide once entered and oxygen escaped. They are the mouths of the forest, frozen mid-inhale. Plants, even ancient ones, respond to the air around them. When oxygen is scarce and carbon dioxide high, they open more pores to drink what they need. But when oxygen is plentiful and carbon dioxide falls, they need fewer. In the fossils of the Carboniferous, the leaves carry only a scattering of these tiny mouths, far fewer than any era that followed. Each one is bordered by cells that once opened and closed in rhythm with the sun, now sealed in time. Their scarcity tells us the air was rich beyond measure, a sky so full of breath that the plants no longer had to strain to live. It is astonishing that something so small, a pattern no thicker than paper, can hold the memory of an entire atmosphere, yet it does. Each pore, each cell, is a syllable in the story of a planet learning to breathe. When scientists gather these clues, the charcoal's blackened flame, the isotope's quiet ratios, the fossil leaves' geometry, they form a picture not of catastrophe, but of continuity, a planet alive enough to leave fingerprints on stone. The data may come from machines, microscopes, and equations, but what they reveal feels deeply human, that air itself carries memory. The oxygen we breathe today is not separate from that ancient abundance. It is its descendant, refined, tempered, balanced by time. Each breath we take contains atoms that once drifted through the Carboniferous canopy, that once fed the flames of a forest or filled the wings of a dragonfly. To hold a piece of fossil charcoal or a leaf pressed into rock is to touch a record of the sky. The evidence is small, quiet, and cold, yet it carries the warmth of what once was, the pulse of a living earth caught between fire and growth. The planet has cooled since then, its fires faded, its air steadied into the thin calm we know. But beneath us, the record remains, in the seams of coal, in the pores of stone, in the weight of carbon still whispering through time. To study these traces is not only to read the past, it is to listen as the earth remembers. The earth has always been a patient teacher. It moves in cycles too vast for a single lifetime to see. Yet every leaf, every stone, and every breath we take carries the traces of its lessons. Among them, one truth stands above all: balance is never still. It is a rhythm, not a point, and the world is forever adjusting to keep its breath steady. After the Carboniferous, the planet began to remember this truth. It had once filled its lungs too deeply, drawing oxygen from sunlight and water until the very air turned dangerous. Fires swept through forests that could not stop growing, and the atmosphere itself became unstable, poised between abundance and destruction. The earth had inhaled too much, so slowly it began to exhale. The balance between carbon and oxygen, once tilted so far, started to find its way back. The same forests that had given so freely began to fade as the climate cooled and the swamps dried. Decomposition caught up to creation. The buried carbon, once locked away in peat and coal, stopped accumulating so quickly. Oxygen, no longer pushed higher, drifted downward toward safety. It was not an act of will, but of physics and chemistry, the quiet machinery of a planet correcting itself. Every system on Earth, from the smallest raindrop to the vast exchange of gases between ocean and sky, is tied together by invisible threads. When one changes, the others pull back. The Carboniferous was the proof of how far those threads can stretch before they begin to tighten again. Too much oxygen, and fire spreads like fever; too little, and life suffocates. Between those extremes lies a narrow window, a space so thin that existence itself depends on it. The Earth has spent billions of years learning how to stay within that fragile range. Each forest, each ocean current, each storm is part of the same balancing act. The deep sea absorbs what the trees release. The soil breathes in rhythm with the sky. Even the quiet decay of a fallen leaf participates, returning carbon to the air, restoring what the living have taken. In this endless loop, no element stands alone. Oxygen depends on carbon, which depends on life, which depends on fire, which in turn depends on oxygen again. It is a circle without beginning or end, a conversation between matter and motion that has shaped every era of Earth's history. The Carboniferous showed what happens when one voice in that conversation grows too loud. The plants that conquered the land gave more than the world could hold. In their success, they created their own undoing, flooding the air with oxygen until fire became inevitable. The forests that had lifted the planet into abundance were the same that later burned it back into balance. There is a kind of beauty in that symmetry. Even destruction, in the grand pattern of things, becomes correction. The flames that consumed those ancient jungles returned carbon to the atmosphere, restoring the air to levels that life could bear. What looked like chaos was in truth the earth remembering its limits. And yet, these adjustments are never gentle. They unfold in ages, not moments, and their cost is measured in extinction and rebirth. The insects that once filled the skies fell silent. New creatures rose in their place, built for leaner air, more cautious lungs. Life reshaped itself to match the planet's new rhythm. The Earth, through all of this, kept breathing. Slowly, steadily, it found its middle ground again. The oxygen that had once soared beyond 30% settled near 21, a level that still holds today. It is not perfect, but it is enough, the delicate balance that allows both flame and life to coexist without either consuming the other. When scientists study these ancient cycles, they are not only measuring gases and rocks, they are reading a story about restraint. The Earth has shown again and again that excess always carries a cost. Abundance without limit turns on itself. Scarcity invites renewal. Balance, fragile as it is, emerges only through tension. This dance between carbon, oxygen, fire, and life continues even now. The forests still breathe for the planet, their leaves exchanging gases in patterns older than language. The oceans still hold vast stores of carbon, waiting to rise or sink depending on the air above them. Volcanoes still exhale the deep breath of the earth, while ice and soil record every fluctuation in its composition. The same chemistry that once fed flames in the Carboniferous now feeds our fires today. When we burn the coal and oil born from that age, we release the air it once trapped. We are, in a sense, unlearning the lesson the planet took millions of years to master. The atmosphere shifts once more, the balance quivering under the weight of human breath and flame. But even now, the Earth remains what it has always been, a living system capable of correction. It will find its way back as it always does, though perhaps not in forms we will recognize, for balance is not peace, it is motion, constant and unending. Somewhere deep in the quiet archives of the earth, the Carboniferous still whispers its warning that every excess invites a return, that even the air can burn, and that life itself is bound by the chemistry of its own survival. And above that whisper, the world continues to breathe, steady as ever, suspended between too much and too little, between fire and silence, between chaos and calm. It has always been this way. It always will be. When the world burned and then fell silent, not everything perished. Beneath the fading forests, in the shallow waters and shaded crevices, life continued its patient work. The giants had vanished, their reign cut short by the thinning air, but the earth did not empty. It whispered instead through small movements, soft breaths, and quiet endurance. The age of abundance had ended. The Carboniferous jungles, once thick with colossal trees and insects, had collapsed into stillness. The fires that had roared across continents had faded, leaving behind soot, silence, and soil rich with memory. Oxygen levels had dropped, the air no longer heavy with fire, but light with scarcity. The world had grown smaller, gentler, more fragile, and in that fragility, life began again. It was not the age of giants anymore. It was the age of those who could hide, wait, and adapt. The small creatures, amphibians that slipped between land and water, reptiles that crept along the cooling ground, found safety in places the great ones could not reach. They were not built for dominance, but for survival. In the shallows of drying swamps, the amphibians clung to life. Their skins, once capable of drawing breath from humid air, now cracked under the growing dryness. Yet they adapted. Some grew thicker hides, their bodies learning to lose less water. Others sought refuge in burrows, in shaded ponds that still shimmered under weak light. Their world had changed, and they changed with it, quietly, patiently. The reptiles, meanwhile, stepped further onto the land. They were the true heirs of the new air. Their lungs were stronger. Their eggs no longer needed the safety of water. They carried their nurseries inside shells, self-contained worlds that could survive under the sun. Where the amphibians depended on moisture, the reptiles thrived in absence. Their scales held the water they needed. Their hearts beat in slower rhythm, conserving what life could spare. These were not the rulers of an age, not yet. They were survivors, wandering the ashes of one world and planting the beginnings of another. In the cooling air, forests became sparser. The great lycopsids had fallen, and in their place smaller plants took root, seed ferns, early conifers, and shrubs that could endure drought and poor soil. Their seeds carried the promise of distance borne by wind instead of water. The land that had once been bound to swamps began to stretch, dry and open, waiting for creatures bold enough to walk farther. Each breath of this new world was different. The oxygen that once burned through every leaf and lung was now modest. Fires were rare. The air carried no scent of smoke, only the cool aroma of stone and soil. The climate had shifted, and with it the shape of life itself. In this quieter earth, the rules of survival changed. Those who could endure scarcity now had room to grow. Predators became smaller, quicker, relying on stealth instead of strength. Prey learned to burrow and blend into the ground. Everything that lived did so by moving softly, wasting nothing. These quiet survivors became the architects of what would come next. From the small reptiles that basked in the thin sunlight would emerge entire lineages, ancestors of creatures that would one day rule both land and sky. From the amphibians, those who lingered near water and learned to endure its loss, would come the enduring patterns of adaptability that would echo through evolution again and again. Even the plants that clung to life in the fading wetlands carried the blueprint for future forests. The first seeds were their gift to the future, small vessels that could travel far, sleep through hardship, and awaken only when the world was ready. The earth was rebuilding itself, but it was in no rush. In the deep time of the planet, recovery does not come in seasons or centuries. It arrives in slow waves, carried by the persistence of those that remain. Each generation, however fragile, adds another layer of endurance, another chance for renewal. The Carboniferous had been a time of grandeur, vast forests, towering trees, and skies that shimmered with wings. But from its collapse came something quieter, wiser. The new world was one that understood restraint. The survivors of the oxygen crash were not shaped by excess, but by endurance. In their smallness, they carried the resilience of all that would follow. The reptiles that crept through the cooling forests, the amphibians that sang softly in the dwindling pools, the plants that pushed fragile shoots through layers of ash, all were fragments of continuity. They were not remnants of what was lost, but beginnings of what was yet to come. In time, these quiet survivors would give rise to creatures of astonishing form, to the scale giants of the Mesozoic, to birds that would one day fill the sky again, to mammals that would breathe warmth into the night. But in this moment, they were simply enduring. The earth had taken a deep breath and exhaled its fire. What remained was calm, and in that calm, the seeds of the next great age took root, waiting beneath the surface of a world that had learned how to breathe again. The earth remembers, not in words or thought, but in balance. Its memory lives in chemistry, in the quiet adjustments of air and sea. It recalls what happened when abundance turned to danger, when breath itself became fire. The age of 35% oxygen left a scar written not on the surface, but within the planet's long and patient rhythm. When the fires cooled and the forests sank into silence, the earth did not forget. In the ages that followed, the air softened. Oxygen, once wild and unrestrained, learned to settle. The atmosphere no longer climbed toward its perilous peaks. It found a rhythm nearer to calm, around 21%, the balance the world has kept ever since. It was as if the planet, through quiet trial, had learned caution. The Carboniferous had been a triumph of life and a warning. The forests that once filled the air with oxygen had almost undone themselves, feeding an atmosphere that burned too easily, turning the gift of growth into the risk of ignition. So, as climates shifted and continents drifted, the planet's cycles adjusted. The Earth began to regulate its own breath. Volcanoes, long muted by the greenery above, exhaled again, They sent carbon dioxide back into the sky, softening the intensity of oxygen's rain. The oceans absorbed and released in measured pulses. Microbes deep in the soil consumed excess oxygen, returning carbon to the air and helping to calm the imbalance. None of it was intentional, yet it felt like wisdom, a slow remembering through feedback and flame. The forests that rose afterward were quieter, more deliberate. They no longer sought the endless reach of their Carboniferous ancestors. The jungles of the Permian were leaner, their roots anchored in drier ground, their growth tempered by change. Fire had shaped them, reshaped the chemistry of their world, and left a whispering caution in the wind. From that time forward, oxygen never reached 35% again. The earth had found its narrow path between suffocation and flame. The air began to behave as if self aware, a system of balance written in combustion and decay. When oxygen crept too high, fire returned, not as devastation, but as correction. Flames swept through the undergrowth, consuming the surplus and returning carbon to the sky. What had once been chaos became stability. Fire, once the destroyer, became a guardian. Every forest that grew was fated to burn eventually, its ash returning to soil, its smoke to sky. Through loss, the world sustained itself. The cycle of burning and rebirth became the planet's heartbeat, a quiet equilibrium between life and its own undoing. In the oceans, the rhythm continued. Phytoplankton bloomed in vast, glittering clouds across the surface, drawing in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen in waves of invisible breath. When they died, they drifted downward, carrying the excess with them into the cold deep. There, the planet stored what it could not yet use, keeping the surface steady. The seas had become lungs, vast, slow, and reliable. It is humbling to think that the air we breathe now is not an accident of chemistry, but the result of memory. The earth learned, not through thought, but through pattern, through the slow dialogue between life and flame. Every molecule of oxygen carries the trace of that lesson, shaped by the time when the planet burned too brightly. The atmosphere no longer rushes toward excess. Oxygen still rises, but never too far. Forests grow, but never endlessly. Fire returns, but only to restore. The air has become a living contract, a balance upheld by everything that breathes and everything that burns. Even the flames of today remember that balance. A candle flickers in air, just rich enough to live, just restrained enough to die when left alone. Too little oxygen, and the flame falters. Too much, and it devours itself. The same law holds for forests, oceans, and lungs alike, life sustained by its own limits. When we look at the air around us, it feels constant, unchanging, yet it is the product of hundreds of millions of years of quiet correction, of feedback and forgiveness. The steadiness of our 21% oxygen is not chance, it is the Earth's way of breathing with care. That steadiness allowed the next ages to unfold. Reptiles rose from the shadowed swamps to walk beneath open skies. New forests grew beneath gentler suns. The oceans shimmered with life once more. Each breath drawn by these creatures was part of the same calm rhythm, set long ago by a planet that had learned not to overbreathe. Even now, that memory endures. The cycles of photosynthesis and fire, of burial and decay, still speak to each other in silence. The planet's lungs inhale and exhale, never straying too far, as though wary of the fever that once consumed it. The earth has grown cautious. It moves slowly now, breathes evenly, listens to itself. Every tree that grows carries the echo of one that burned. Every breeze carries the faint scent of the world that once burned too fiercely. The planet remembers, and so it breathes gently, as if aware that even the brightest fire must learn restraint. Every breath we take carries an inheritance. not the kind written in genes alone, but one shaped by the air itself, by the chemistry of an ancient world that once nearly burned. The story of 35% oxygen did not end when the fires dimmed. It lives on in the design of lungs and leaves, in the rhythm of every heartbeat, and in the quiet pulse of life that never stopped adapting to the balance of the sky. When you inhale, the air you draw in is not simply atmosphere, it is memory. It carries the blueprint of a billion years of adjustment, of creatures learning how to live in the presence of oxygen, how to use it, and how to survive its danger. Oxygen became the measure by which life learned to pace itself. It became the clock that keeps time inside every living thing. Long ago, before forests and flames, the first cells discovered the power locked within this restless gas. To use oxygen was to play with fire at a microscopic scale. It gave life a way to release energy with breathtaking efficiency, but it also brought risk. Every reaction that gave energy also threatened destruction. Oxygen could build and burn at the same time. Over millions of years, evolution learned to tame it. Inside every cell, a balance formed, controlled combustion, restrained energy. Mitochondria became the furnaces of life, consuming oxygen and releasing warmth. They worked as carefully as any alchemist, feeding on the air to transform food into movement and thought. And so oxygen became our inner rhythm. In a world with less of it, life slowed. In a world with more, it burned too fast. The balance of oxygen dictated not just who could survive, but how they lived. It set the speed of metabolism, the pulse of flight and stillness, the pace of every heartbeat. From the smallest insect to the largest mammal, the breath of the planet became the metronome of biology. The legacy of that ancient atmosphere lives in our lungs. The soft branching pattern inside each one is not random. It echoes the old forests, fractal, endless, reaching outward to gather as much surface as possible. Every alveolus, every delicate bubble where air meets blood, mirrors the old relationship between air and life. It is the shape of the planet's own memory, folded into flesh. In fish, the same legacy flows through gills, where thin filaments pull oxygen from water with silent precision. Even in plants, it lives in reverse, in the tiny pores that open and close across their leaves, exchanging gases with the same caution that ancient forests once failed to learn. Every living thing breathes within limits born from that age. If you could see oxygen not as invisible molecules, but as light, you would see it glowing everywhere, in the shimmer of green leaves, in the slow exhale of soil, in the rise and fall of a sleeping chest. It is the pulse that links the world together. Oxygen does not merely feed us, it measures us. Our brains depend on it more than any other organ, and the rate at which we think, dream, and remember is tethered to its flow. Every spark of thought is a spark of oxygen transformed, a remnant of that ancient fire turned inward. The very act of awareness, the flicker of consciousness, is built upon the chemistry of a world that once burned too brightly. It is strange to realize that the air we treat as background is a living archive. Each molecule you breathe has passed through countless lives before yours, through leaves, through oceans, through the lungs of other creatures and the hearts of storms. It may have been part of a dragonfly's flight in the Carboniferous, or trapped inside a coal seam for eons before being released again. In that sense, breathing is an act of remembrance. The oxygen that enters you now once filled the wings of giants, once fed the flames that cleansed the earth, once rose from forests so vast they covered continents, and it will pass on, carried into the breath of others long after you are gone. Even now, the same chemistry that drove the old world shapes the limits of this one. Too little oxygen, and life slows, its thoughts and movements fading to stillness. Too much, and it begins to unravel, the same invisible power that sustains it turning corrosive. Every cell walks that line, a balance held steady by evolution's long memory. The planet learned its caution, and so did life. We carry that caution in every breath, the gentle, constant awareness of how close we live to both fire and silence. To breathe is to rehearse what the earth itself learned in its long struggle between abundance and restraint. It is to feel the chemistry of the ancient sky alive within us, keeping time in heartbeats and quiet exhales. Somewhere within each breath is the story of the planet's great lesson that life is not sustained by excess, but by balance, that oxygen is both gift and test. And so, every time you breathe, you join an unbroken thread that began in the Carboniferous jungles, in the air that once made insects giants and forests burn. The air remembers, even if we do not. Each inhale is a whisper of the ancient world, each exhale its quiet echo, the legacy of a planet that learned long ago how to breathe wisely. The story of 35% oxygen did not vanish into stone. It lives quietly in the rhythm of the world we see today, carried in the chemistry of forests, in the breath of leaves, in the soft crackle of a flame beneath the wind. Every ecosystem, from the driest savanna to the thickest rainforest, still dances to the same invisible choreography that once filled the carboniferous skies. The earth learned balance through trial, and its memory lingers in every seed that burns, every tree that grows back, every cycle that turns destruction into renewal. When we watch a forest fire today, it can feel like loss, a consuming heat that devours the living. But deep beneath that surface lies the oldest feedback system life ever designed. Fire is not the enemy of life, it is its regulator, its quiet sculptor. In the Carboniferous, oxygen and flame ruled together. That bond has not broken, it has only softened. Modern fires burn under an atmosphere of restraint, no longer feeding on air that ignites too easily, but still powered by the same chemistry. When wood burns, carbon reunites with oxygen, releasing the energy once captured by sunlight. What falls as ash returns to the soil, nourishing new roots. In this way, fire and growth remain partners, each keeping the other in check. The forests that regrow after flame are stronger, more diverse, tuned to survive the rhythm of burning and rebirth. Their seeds open only in the heat. Their roots wait deep below, knowing that the end of one forest is the beginning of another. This is not coincidence, it is memory. Every forest alive today carries within it the imprint of that ancient balance, the same dance of oxygen, carbon, and fire that shaped the air millions of years ago. Our rainforests, vast and humid, are living echoes of the Carboniferous jungles. Their leaves still trade gases with the sky in the same quiet conversation, exhaling oxygen and absorbing carbon dioxide in delicate equilibrium. Each breath of the forest changes the air around it, and the air, in turn, decides how the forest grows. It is a loop as endless as time itself, one that began when plants first reached for the light and discovered how to turn sunlight into breath. If you stand in a rainforest today, where moisture clings to every leaf and the air feels alive with green, you are standing inside that same chemical symphony. Every droplet of vapor, every flicker of light passing through the canopy, is part of the same process that once made the world flammable. The oxygen produced here feeds creatures across the globe, and the carbon it draws in balances the sky above. The difference is that now the system hums within a gentler range, the planet's memory keeping it from tipping too far, but the echo goes deeper still. Fire-dependent ecosystems, the grasslands of Africa, the eucalyptus forests of Australia, the pine savannas of North America, are all living proof that flame never left its role in shaping life. These places rely on fire to survive. Their seeds wait for heat to open. Their soil is fertilized by ash. Their growth surges only after the burn. The pattern is precise, ancient, and beautiful. Even the carbon itself, the element at the heart of this cycle, carries the rhythm of the past. It moves endlessly between living and non living, between air and stone, between root and atmosphere. Plants capture it through photosynthesis, animals release it through breath, and fire returns it to the sky. It is a continuous loop, oxygen rising, carbon falling, fire breathing life back into the air. The same chemistry that once pushed the planet toward chaos now sustains its calm. In the modern rainforest, a single fallen tree feeds dozens of lives, fungi, insects, mosses, all drawing energy from its decay. As it breaks down, it releases carbon back into the air, just as ancient forests once did. Nothing is wasted. The cycle turns, slow and perfect, never ending. Even the smallest details reflect that old balance. The thin layers of soil beneath the forest floor store carbon much like the peat swamps of the Carboniferous once did. The pattern repeats, only quieter now, tempered by time and temperature. The earth continues to breathe through its forests, exhaling life in green waves. And when the forest burns, as all forests eventually do, the chemistry of the Carboniferous speaks again. The flames consume the dead, clearing space for the living, restoring nutrients, resetting the system. Then, from the ashes, green returns, each leaf, each stem, repeating the same reaction that keeps the air alive. Our world may look different now, continents reshaped, climates cooled, species evolved, but the script remains the same. The loops of oxygen, carbon, and fire continue their ancient conversation, shaping weather, feeding oceans, maintaining the delicate pressure of life on the edge of possibility. Even the way we breathe follows this rhythm. The oxygen that fills our lungs comes largely from the same process that fills a leaf, the splitting of water by sunlight, the release of air from living matter. It is a planetary chorus of exchange, ongoing and eternal. The Carboniferous gave us the pattern, and the earth has followed it ever since. Life grows, life burns, life returns, air thickens, air thins, air steadies again. Each rise and fall of oxygen leaves a trace in the chemistry of the world, shaping how every organism, every forest, every fire behaves. The rainforests that now cradle our atmosphere are not just survivors of deep time, they are reflections, soft living mirrors of that age when breath and flame ruled the planet. Their roots remember what it meant to overbreathe, and their canopies whisper the same message in the rustle of their leaves, that life endures best when it breathes in rhythm with the earth. The chemistry remains, the memory remains, and through it, the echo of that age still hums beneath the green silence of modern life. Imagine a world where the air begins to change again, where the quiet 21% we breathe today starts to climb, molecule by molecule, toward that long forgotten height of 35. It would not happen in a rush or a blaze, but slowly, through the patient rhythm of photosynthesis, light falling on leaves, plankton blooming in green spirals across the oceans, roots binding carbon deep into soil. The world would begin to breathe more deeply once more. At first, it would seem like renewal. Forests would grow taller, skies would clear, and every breath would carry a crispness that felt like purity. But in that purity lies the memory of danger. The earth has known what happens when abundance becomes imbalance, when the same molecule that sustains life begins to threaten it. It could happen again, in theory. The chemistry allows it. If enough carbon were locked away, buried by forests and sediment, faster than the planet could reclaim it, oxygen would begin to climb. The process would be silent, invisible, a rising tide of reactivity, that no creature would notice until the world itself began to shimmer with its intensity. At 25%, fires would move with greater ease, creeping where today they would fade. At 30, flames would leap from leaf to leaf, fueled by air too eager to feed them. And at 35, the threshold that once changed the earth, even damp wood would burn. A spark would no longer be a moment, but a force. Lightning would no longer just strike, it would ignite. The air itself would become a partner to the flame. You would see it first in the light. Fire would burn whiter, cleaner, more fierce. A forest fire would roar with a voice that carried for miles, its sound deepened by the density of the air. The smoke would hang thicker, fed by its own atmosphere. The world would glow at night, horizons painted in ember, and yet beneath the destruction, life would still adapt. It always does. Plants might evolve thicker bark, seeds that wait out the burn, roots that run deeper. Some would thrive in the ashes, feeding on what the fires left behind. Insects would return to the size of small birds, their bodies once again fed by air that enters them freely. The planet would reinvent itself, reshaping life in the image of its chemistry, just as it did 300 million years ago. But not all would endure. For creatures like us, who breathe in rhythm with the world we know, the change would be quiet and suffocating in its generosity. Each breath would feel too sharp, the air almost metallic. Lungs would draw in more oxygen than blood could carry, and inside our cells, that gift would turn volatile. The same gas that sustains life would begin to corrode it from within. We would live in a world that breathes too quickly for us to keep pace. Even a modest rise would ripple outward. Fires would reshape the climate, releasing carbon back to the air. Oceans would take in the excess, shifting the balance again. The earth would begin to correct itself as it has always done. Flame and chemistry would meet halfway until the scales settled once more. The planet remembers. It has learned not to breathe too deeply. Since the end of the Carboniferous, oxygen has risen and fallen within narrow bounds, never again reaching that perilous abundance. The world discovered equilibrium through fire, through the silent dialogue between growth and decay. Every forest that burns today, every ember that smolders in the dark, is part of that ancient balance still at work. If the air ever grew too rich again, it would not be our laws or machines that restored it. It would be the fire, the earth's oldest instrument of memory. Flames would spread, stripping the air of its excess, teaching the atmosphere restraint once more. The planet would find peace through burning, just as it did before. And yet the idea lingers. A world with air so alive it hums in sunlight, forests breathing faster, their leaves trembling as if in anticipation, the scent of ozone in every wind, the shimmer of a world on the edge of ignition, terrifying, beautiful, alive. It is a reminder of how delicate our present truly is, how everything we know depends on the smallest of margins. The air we breathe is not merely oxygen, it is balance itself, the result of countless fires, countless corrections, countless lessons written into stone and sky. The earth still carries that wisdom. It holds its breath just enough, never too much, letting us live within the narrow space between suffocation and flame. And in that space, every forest, every storm, every heartbeat continues, steady, fragile, and aware of how easily the world can burn too bright again. The air we breathe carries a quiet inheritance. It is the same breath that once filled the carboniferous sky, the same mixture that turned forests into fuel and insects into giants. It is older than memory, older than thought, the lasting trace of a time when the planet's lungs burned with too much life. But now, after hundreds of millions of years of balance, it stirs again, not through volcano or storm, but through us, a single species drawing the Earth's buried breath back to the surface. Beneath our cities lie the remains of those ancient jungles, pressed and dark. They were once alive, endless forests that drank sunlight and exhaled oxygen until the world itself caught flame. When they fell, their trunks sank into the mud, sealed away by pressure and time. Layer by layer, they became stone, oil, and coal. The condensed memory of abundance turned still. For ages, that carbon slept. The air grew calm. The world learned balance until we woke it. When we dig, when we burn, when we light the night with the fire of industry, we are not simply creating heat, we are opening time. The carbon that once cooled the world rises again in invisible clouds, returning to the sky it once shaped. What we call fuel is a form of remembrance, sunlight from 300 million years ago, released in an instant. The flame that drives our machines is the echo of the one that once devoured the forests. Every spark carries an echo. Every engine hums with ancient rhythm. Each exhale of smoke from a factory stack is the earth remembering what it was like to burn too freely. We have become a part of that cycle, accelerators in a chemistry that once moved at the pace of continents. What took the planet millions of years to balance, we awaken in mere centuries. It begins quietly, without sound or color. Gases rise, invisible and unhurried. The air thickens, warmth gathers, oceans breathe heavier. Forests stretch toward the light, growing faster for a time, but their roots drink too deeply. The balance begins to lean. It is not the first time the earth has known imbalance, but this one bears our reflection. We often imagine ourselves outside the rhythm of nature, but we are made from the same breath, the same atoms that once passed through fern, dragonfly, and flame. Each act of combustion we create is a continuation of an ancient process, replayed through human hands. The ground beneath us is not only soil, but the condensed breath of vanished trees, the stored fire of ancient suns. When we release it, the planet stirs in familiar ways. The air grows restless, storms gather, the warmth deepens, forests ignite more easily in the thinner patience of the climate. The oceans shift their moods, their chemistry turning as they absorb what the sky cannot hold. The changes do not come in anger, but in memory. The planet is tracing its old reflexes, revisiting what it once learned through fire. Yet within that pattern lies a strange kind of beauty. The coal we burn once shaded the surface of swamps alive with amphibians. The oil beneath the seabed was once the drifting life of plankton, basking beneath a golden sun. When we draw it out, we connect to that lineage, to the photosynthesis that once filled the world with breath, to the quiet patience of forests that waited for the planet to cool. Even in the burning, we are joined to the chemistry that made us possible. Every breath we take is borrowed from that lineage. The oxygen in our lungs once brushed the wings of ancient insects, once brightened skies over a world that burned and healed. We are not apart from those epochs, only their continuation, the living extension of oxygen's long experiment with life. And perhaps, as the planet once learned, we will find balance again. The earth has always recovered from its extremes. The forests returned, the air steadied, the fires cooled into soil, and life began again, reshaped by what it had endured. The same resilience moves quietly within us. We carry it in every inhale, every thought, every small act of restraint that keeps the fire from spreading too far. Now the planet breathes through us. The forests that once built the sky lie beneath our feet, and the air they made fills our lungs. The same chemistry that once burned the world now powers our homes, our cities, our lives. The cycle continues, slower, deeper, infinite. The air grows heavier with memory, but it is still alive with promise. It moves through leaf and cloud, through breath and flame, through every living thing that remembers how to begin again. The same molecule that once carried the world to the edge now sustains it, tracing its long path through ages of fire and calm. And so the story continues without pause or question, in the soft rhythm of the planet's breathing, steady, ancient, and aware. There is a quiet precision to the way Earth breathes. The air we inhale is not too rich, not too thin, but balanced, a fragile equilibrium that defines every living thing on the planet. Between the extremes of flame and suffocation lies a narrow window where life can exist, move, and think. It is inside this invisible window that we are born, and it is only through luck and time that we have stayed within it. Too little oxygen, and the body falters, the cells slow, the muscles ache, and thought itself dims. Too much, and the same gas that gives life begins to burn it away, corroding tissues, igniting forests, and tearing through the delicate machinery of cells. Between those two limits, between scarcity and fire, life found its rhythm, a balance as thin as breath. That balance is no accident. It is the product of billions of years of feedback, the earth adjusting its own chemistry with every generation of life that appeared upon it. When early plants began to release oxygen into the atmosphere, they unknowingly rewrote the rules of survival. What was once a world of slow, simple reactions became one of energy and speed. Oxygen allowed cells to extract far more power from the food they consumed. It made movement possible, thought possible, complexity possible. It became the silent clockwork behind everything that breathes. A single molecule of oxygen, taken in and used, fuels a chain of reactions that powers the heart, the wings, the fins, the roots. It is the reason animals can move faster than the plants that sustain them. It is the reason we can think, dream, and run. Yet this same gift binds every creature to the atmosphere's chemistry, tying the scale of life to the thin layer of gas surrounding the planet. There is a limit to what oxygen allows. When its concentration drops below 15%, fire cannot live, and neither can we. Muscles fail, metabolism slows, and the warmth of blood begins to fade. At 21%, where it is now, life thrives in balance. Muscles burn with energy, forests grow without constant flame, and the air neither feeds destruction nor starves it. But if oxygen were to rise much higher, beyond 30, even the rain would struggle to stop the burning. Wood would ignite easily, leaves would dry in seconds, and the world would once again shimmer with firelight, as it did in the Carboniferous. It is strange then to realize how much of life depends on this single, invisible ratio. A few breaths more or less, and the entire history of the planet would have been different. Every species that exists today has evolved within this narrow window. The way we breathe, the way we grow, the way our hearts beat, all of it is calibrated to this mix of gases. Birds can fly because the air holds just enough oxygen to feed their rapid metabolism without burning them from within. Fish draw what they need from water that carries only a fraction of that oxygen, yet even they are shaped by its scarcity. Plants regulate the air itself, exhaling what we inhale, inhaling what we exhale, keeping the cycle steady with the precision of a heartbeat. We are not just living in this balance, we are part of the mechanism that maintains it. And yet, this balance has never been guaranteed. The Earth has lost it before, and it could lose it again. The atmosphere has swung wildly through time, sometimes rich enough to feed fires across continents, sometimes thin enough to smother life at sea level. Each swing left its mark on the creatures that lived through it. The size of insects, the depth of oceans, the evolution of lungs, all of these are written records of how oxygen once rose and fell. Even now, the air's stability is a kind of miracle. The balance between carbon and oxygen, between fire and breath, is held together by countless small processes: the bloom of plankton in the sea, the fall of leaves in autumn, the respiration of roots in the dark. It is a vast conversation between the living and the dead, between what breathes and what burns. And we stand in the middle of that conversation, often without hearing it. The air moves through us quietly, a gift from the same chemical balance that once nearly destroyed the planet. Every inhale is an act of faith in that equilibrium, a reminder that we live not because the earth is stable, but because it has learned to keep its instability in check. Some scientists call it the oxygen window, the narrow range where life can survive and fire can exist without consuming the world. It is only a sliver in the scale of chemistry, yet everything that moves, grows, and thinks depends on it. Outside that window, the planet would fall silent, either frozen in stillness or consumed by its own breath. To live here, now, is to stand on the edge of that window, balanced between past and possibility. The air we breathe is not just a mixture of gases, but a record of restraint, the memory of a planet that once overreached and learned the cost. The wind carries that memory still, across oceans, through forests, into our lungs. It is the same air that once fed the dragonflies of the Carboniferous, the same molecules that burned in ancient storms and cooled again into calm. And within that air lies the quiet truth of all living things, that we are sustained not by abundance, but by balance, and that every breath we take is a delicate negotiation between life and the fire that makes it possible. The window stays open for now. The world breathes, and through it, so do we. Every breath is part of a pattern so old it feels eternal. The balance of oxygen on Earth is not an accident, nor the product of any single force. It is a quiet choreography between chemistry, water, sunlight, and stone, a conversation that began long before thought existed and has continued ever since. In the beginning, there was only ocean and light. In those shallow, shimmering seas, tiny cyanobacteria learned a secret that changed the world. With sunlight as their guide, they began to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, turning the radiance of the sun into breath. What drifted upward from those early cells was invisible and fragile, but persistent. Over countless generations, those bubbles of oxygen began to fill the air. The seas turned red as the gas reacted with dissolved iron, rusting the ocean itself. Over time, that oxygen transformed the planet's skin, carving blue skies out of haze, and setting the stage for everything that would one day move, swim, or fly. It was the planet's first breath, and from it came the rhythm that would define every age to follow. Oxygen is both gift and burden. The same molecule that feeds life also erodes it. It allows cells to burn energy, but it also burns them in return. The world learned early that survival meant balance, that abundance required restraint. And so, over billions of years, the planet built a system of feedback, subtle, patient, self-correcting. When plants draw in carbon dioxide, they release oxygen. When they die and decompose, that oxygen returns to the soil and sky. Some of their carbon becomes part of new life, some sinks into sediment and stone. If too much carbon is buried, oxygen begins to rise, feeding wildfires that sweep across the land. Those fires return carbon to the air, and the balance steadies once again. The oceans breathe in their own way. Phytoplankton rise to meet the light, filling the water with oxygen, then sink when they die, carrying carbon into the deep. In the darkness below, microbes continue the exchange, releasing some gases, trapping others. Even the heat of the planet joins the cycle, volcanoes exhaling carbon dioxide from stone, renewing what has been buried. Each part of this loop is linked to the others. Soil and sea, air and fire, every element shares the same pulse. If one moves too far, the others adjust. When oxygen grows too plentiful, flame restores the balance. When it falls, life finds new ways to feed the air. The rhythm never ends. It slows and accelerates, but it never stops. It is not a plan. The earth does not choose. It reacts, and in those reactions, equilibrium emerges. Like an organism breathing through time, it inhales and exhales across the ages, each breath carrying the trace of the last. The balance is delicate, but not fragile. It bends, it learns, it continues. Today, the same choreography continues around us. Forests inhale carbon and exhale oxygen. Fires return that oxygen to the air as smoke. The oceans absorb and release, rising and falling with the seasons. Ice locks away ancient air, and when it melts, frees it again. Every process is a note in the same song, quiet, recursive, unending. The difference between life and silence lies in the narrowest range. If oxygen slipped much lower, vast ecosystems would fade. If it rose much higher, the air could ignite under the spark of a storm. Our atmosphere sits balanced between these extremes, thin, clear, precise. And though its chemistry is measured in parts per hundred, its meaning stretches through everything. The wings of birds move with the breath of trees. The glow of a firefly depends on oxygen exhaled by plankton drifting in faraway seas. Every heartbeat is tied to photosynthesis happening somewhere else. Life is not separate acts, but one continuous exchange. Even within our own bodies, the same rhythm plays. We breathe in oxygen, burn it softly within, and release carbon dioxide back to the air. Each exhale joins the larger breath of the planet, echoing the first exchange that began in the ancient sea. The physics of gases, the chemistry of photosynthesis, the biology of respiration, all are threads in one unbroken pattern that sustains the blue veil around the earth. The planet does not seek perfection, it finds motion instead, an equilibrium written in flux, a constancy born from change. The wonder lies not in how it began, but in how it endures, rebuilding itself from imbalance again and again. As the wind moves through the trees and across the sea, carrying the faint scent of life and salt, it feels almost like breath. The earth continues to exhale softly into the open sky, keeping time with all that has ever lived, steady, quiet, and beautifully alive. There is something timeless about air. It moves freely across oceans and centuries, slipping through leaves, lungs, and clouds without ever aging. The molecules that drift through you at this moment have drifted before, through forests that no longer stand, through the wings of creatures long turned to stone, through the firelight of worlds we can only imagine. Every breath you take carries the memory of the planet. In the stillness of the night, when the wind feels soft and weightless, it is easy to forget what air truly is. It is not empty. It is not nothing. It is a vast, invisible ocean of particles, each one a survivor of uncountable transformations. Oxygen atoms born in the hearts of ancient stars, scattered into space by explosions, captured by this young planet, and woven into everything that breathes. Nitrogen spun from cosmic dust, trapped in lightning and rain, then released again through decay. Carbon moving endlessly between life and stone, never resting long in one form. The atmosphere is not a boundary, it is a memory in motion. It remembers the great forests of the Carboniferous, those endless swamps of green that filled the world with breath. It remembers the insects that rose above them, wings wide against air so thick with oxygen that even a spark could turn the sky to flame. When those forests fell, when their leaves sank beneath the water and their trunks turned to stone, the air did not forget. The molecules that once flowed through those trees still float among us, silent and unchanged. Some of the oxygen you breathe tonight once passed through the spiracles of a dragonfly, larger than your hand, through the tissues of ferns that reached higher than modern trees. Some of it once fed the fires that swept through Carboniferous jungles, charring their remains into coal, and some of it, long after, found its way into the lungs of the first mammals, the first birds, the first humans who looked up and wondered what the sky was made of. The air does not belong to time, it belongs to motion. It has circled the planet for billions of years, mixing, thinning, renewing, never staying still. Every gust of wind carries stories, though it tells them without sound. The same molecules that touched the gills of ancient fish may now brush the surface of your skin. The same breath that left the mouth of an early ancestor might, even now, drift in the same wind that cools your face. Through this endless circulation, the air has become an archive of everything that has ever lived or burned or bloomed. It contains traces of volcanic ash from the first eruptions, salt from ancient seas, soot from forgotten fires. It carries pollen from trees that no longer exist, dust from deserts that once were oceans, the faint residue of every age the planet has endured. The air has seen it all. It watched the rise of forests and the silence that followed their collapse. It carried the cries of the first reptiles, the echoes of creatures that no human eyes have ever seen. It floated above the waves when continents were still drifting into place. It whispered across ice during the frozen epochs, where breath condensed into frost and fell back to the earth. And now it flows through us. Each inhale is a reunion, a continuation of the same exchange that began when life first learned to breathe. We call it respiration, but it is more than that. It is communion, a shared inheritance between every living thing that has ever existed. When you breathe, you join the same rhythm that connected insects to trees, trees to oceans, and oceans to clouds. Somewhere within you now are atoms once part of another being's breath. Perhaps they came from a forest fire that burned 100 million years ago. Perhaps they passed through a trilobite, or a fern, or a mammoth. Perhaps they escaped the lungs of a child who laughed beneath a medieval sky. The molecules never fade, they only travel. Even human history is written faintly in the air. The oxygen that fed the fires of ancient hearths still lingers, now blended with the smoke of cities, the breath of billions, the residue of machines. The atmosphere holds the fingerprints of our entire species, a chemical record of every transformation we have set in motion. Our factories, our forests, our fields, all add their signature to the planet's breath. Yet for all our influence, we are only the newest participants in this exchange. The air has seen empires rise and dissolve into dust. It has carried the scent of their fires, their festivals, their wars, and their silence. It remembers everything, but judges nothing. It simply continues, timeless and indifferent, circling the world as it always has. In its constant motion lies a strange kind of peace. The molecules that once fed the flames of ancient ages now nourish the lungs of children. The atoms that once turned to ash are reborn as leaves. The breath that once carried over primeval jungles now stirs the surface of the sea. Every inhalation is a reminder that nothing in nature is ever truly lost. We are living inside the memory of the air. Each moment we breathe, we add to its story, a story older than stone, softer than light, written not in words but in motion. The atmosphere is the planet's diary, kept not on paper but in chemistry, where every molecule holds the trace of a life, a fire, a storm. And so, when you breathe again, slowly, quietly, remember what fills your lungs. You are inhaling the past, sharing your breath with everything that has ever lived. You are connected to all that came before, through the same air that never forgets. The atmosphere carries no beginning and no end. It is the planet's oldest witness, its oldest story, and it still whispers, softly, endlessly, through every living breath. The air that once fed giants now fills our lungs. It moves through us as it once moved through forests of towering ferns, through the spiracles of dragonflies the size of hawks, through the endless jungles that turned the world into a breathing flame. Every molecule of it has been here before, scattered, borrowed, returned. It is the oldest thing we touch and the only thing that never truly leaves us. Each inhale is a thread in the story of the planet. It ties us quietly to every living thing that has ever drawn breath, to the fish that first tasted oxygen in water, to the trees that filled the sky with it, to the fires that once burned too fiercely beneath its weight. We are part of that lineage, bound by the same chemistry that shaped worlds and decided which lives could exist. There is a stillness in knowing this. To breathe is to join in a rhythm older than memory, a balance so fine that the smallest change could turn life to ash. Oxygen has always been both the giver and the destroyer, the delicate knife edge upon which life balances. For every heart that beats, for every leaf that opens to the light, there is the quiet risk written into the air itself. Too little and we fade, too much and we burn, yet here we are, suspended in the perfect middle, as if the earth has learned over time how much breath to keep and how much to give away. The atmosphere hums with that precision, a fragile harmony maintained by oceans, forests, and the hidden labor of countless unseen lives. The world continues to breathe through its own design, neither too fast nor too slow, adjusting in small, imperceptible ways to keep its balance. It is humbling to realize that we exist inside this quiet compromise. We spend our days within a thin layer of gases wrapped around the earth, a veil no thicker in scale than the skin of an apple. All that we are, all that we build, all that we dream depends on the chemistry held within that fragile film. Beyond it lies the silence of space, and below it the solid memory of stone. Between those two extremes, we live in the breath. The air feels infinite, but it is not. It has limits, just as we do. It is made and unmade every moment, in the photosynthesis of leaves, in the slow respiration of soil, in the quiet exchange between ocean and sky. The world exhales and inhales endlessly, and we are folded into that motion without ever noticing. Every breath we take is borrowed from something else. Perhaps that is what makes life so sacred, that it is not ours alone. When we breathe, we are sharing with the trees that line the horizon, with the algae blooming in the sea, with the invisible plankton drifting through the sunlit surface of the ocean. The same air that enters your lungs will one day rise again into a cloud, cross the world, and fall into the sea. It will dissolve, be taken up by coral or kelp or fish, then rise again into another sky, to begin again in someone else's breath. In this way, there are no boundaries between us and the rest of life. The air moves freely, stitching us together across time and distance. We are all participants in the same act, breathing, exhaling, and returning what we borrow. And still, the line between survival and catastrophe remains as thin as ever. The same chemistry that sustains us could turn against us if we push it too far. The balance is not guaranteed. It is maintained through the cooperation of all living systems, oceans that absorb what we release, forests that cleanse what we burn, microorganisms that cycle what we forget. The planet's breath is our own, and it depends on our restraint as much as its resilience. But this is not a story meant to warn. It is a story meant to awaken wonder, because wonder, not fear, is what keeps us connected to the air, to the earth, to one another. It is the quiet realization that everything we are began with a molecule of oxygen formed in the heart of a dying star, billions of years before our species drew its first breath. That same atom cast into space found its way here to this thin blue world to become part of a leaf, a lung, a life. So much has changed, and yet the rhythm remains the same. The earth still breathes, the oceans still whisper to the sky, the forests still turn light into air, and the air still carries their gift across the globe. When you step outside and feel the wind against your face, you are touching everything: the ancient jungles, the forgotten fires, the breath of creatures that no longer exist. You are breathing the same air that watched continents drift apart, that cooled molten stone, that filled the wings of prehistoric flight. And as you exhale, you add your own breath to that eternal current. It joins the atmosphere, the same way all things eventually do, not lost, only continued. The air remembers you, just as it remembers everything. The same oxygen that once fed giants now fills your lungs, and in return, you give back what keeps the planet alive. This exchange, this fragile balance, is the quiet pulse that binds all of Earth's history into one endless breath. And when the wind moves again, carrying your exhale into the sky, it becomes part of the same story, the story of air, of life, of survival, written softly across time. It is the breath that connects us all.